Imagine you are in ancient Rome. In front of you stands a young emperor, hardly older than a modern student, surrounded by advisors, soldiers, intrigues, and a mother who is grasping for power herself. His name is Nero. For some, he was an artist, a reformer, a ruler with big dreams. For others, he was a monster, a murderer, and the man whose name stands for fire, madness, and doom. But which of these is truth and what is legend? Was Nero really the cruel tyrant that history knows him to be? Or was his image deliberately distorted by enemies, senators, and later chroniclers? Before we dive into this dark and fascinating story, write me your opinion in the comments. Was Nero a dangerous ruler from the beginning, or did he only become the man we know today through power, fear, and intrigue? If you like such historical stories, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss another video about the great characters, power struggles, and turning points of history. Because today we travel back to 1st century Rome, to a world of luxury, blood, propaganda, and burning streets. We tell the story of an emperor who wanted to be loved, was feared, and in the end became a legend, Emperor Nero. 1. The boy who shouldn't be emperor. When Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was born on December 15, 37 AD, no one suspected that this child would one day be one of the most notorious rulers in world history under the name Nero. He did not come into an ordinary family, but into the most dangerous center of Roman power. From the very beginning, his birth was associated with glamour, ambition, and threat. Rome was no longer a republic at that time, even if old republican forms still existed. The Senate met, offices were assigned, speeches were made, but the real power had long since rested with the imperial family. Those who were born into this family did not simply live in prosperity. He lived in a web of expectations, intrigues, alliances, and deadly rivalries. Nero's father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, came from a respected Roman noble family. The name Ahenobarbus meant something like red beard and was associated with a long aristocratic tradition. But this father was not considered an exemplary man in ancient sources. He was described as haughty, violent, and unscrupulous. It is difficult to say whether these descriptions are completely just, because Roman historians love to morally exaggerate characters. What is certain, however, is that Nero did not come from a quiet, stable home. His father died when Nero was still a small child. The boy thus lost a male guardian figure at an early age, but perhaps this loss was less decisive than the role of the woman who was to shape his life more than any other person, his mother Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina was not a woman who was satisfied with a supporting role. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, sister of Emperor Caligula, niece and later wife of Emperor Claudius, and mother of Nero. It combined origin, ambition, and political instinct. She knew very well that descent in the Roman imperial house meant power, but also danger. Those who stood too close to the rule could be exalted, but just as quickly destroyed. Agrippina had learned early on how unpredictable imperial politics could be. Her brother Caligula, who had ruled since 37 AD, began his reign with great hope, but was soon perceived as cruel, capricious, and dangerous. During his reign, Agrippina also fell into disgrace. She was banished, her property was confiscated, and her young son Nero was temporarily removed from the immediate circle of power. These early experiences are important for understanding Nero's later development. He did not grow up in an atmosphere of security, but in a world in which power could tip at any time. A child in the imperial family learned early on that proximity to the throne meant not only privilege, but also danger to life. Young Lucius experienced that his mother was banished, that his property was threatened, and that his own fate depended on decisions made by others. He was still too young to fully understand the political context, but the uncertainty of his childhood must have shaped him. In Rome, you could be born with a big name and still be powerless. After the assassination of Caligula in 41, the situation changed again. Claudius became emperor, a man whom many had previously underestimated. Agrippina was allowed to return from exile, and Nero moved closer to the imperial court again. But even now, his path to power was by no means predetermined. Claudius had a son of his own, Britannicus, who was considered a natural heir. Nero was of noble descent, but he was not the first candidate for succession. That's exactly what makes his story so exciting. Nero was not simply born as an inevitable emperor. His rise was the result of political calculation, family strategy, and his mother's tireless ambition. Agrippina understood that her son could only have a future at the center of power if she herself gained influence. She married Emperor Claudius in 49, although this union seems unusual from today's perspective, because Claudius was her uncle. In the Roman elite, however, political marriages were not romantic decisions, but instruments of power. Through this marriage, Agrippina became empress and was able to bring Nero step by step into a better position. Claudius adopted Nero, which gave him the name Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. This adoption was of enormous political importance. It placed Nero next to Britannicus and gave him a dynastic legitimacy that he had not previously possessed in this strength. For the young Nero, this change meant a huge leap. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus became Nero, a member of the Claudian imperial family. His name, his dress, his upbringing, and his public role became part of a grand political plan. He was no longer seen as the child of an ambitious mother, but as a possible successor to the emperor. Public perception played a decisive role in this. In Rome, power had to be made visible. Anyone who wanted to be considered a future ruler had to be presented as such to the people, the Senate, and the army. Nero received honors, appeared in public, and was married to Octavia, the daughter of Claudius. This marriage, too, was less a personal connection than a dynastic signal. Nero was to be firmly linked to the imperial line. His education was carefully designed. One of his most important teachers was Seneca, a philosopher, writer, and politician who would later become one of the most influential advisors to the young emperor. Seneca embodied education, rhetoric, and moral philosophy, but also adaptability to power. He could write about virtue and at the same time work at the court of an emperor where intrigue and violence were part of everyday life. For Nero, this education meant that he came into contact with literature, oratory, and Greek culture at an early age. In particular, his inclination towards art, music, and public appearances later became famous and infamous. Even in his youth, he showed an interest in things that could be problematic for a Roman emperor. A ruler was allowed to promote culture, but he was not supposed to stand on stage like a professional artist. For the Roman upper class, this was a question of dignity, rank, and social order. But as a child and adolescent, Nero was not yet the man that later sources describe as a tyrant. He was an adolescent who was pushed into a role bigger than himself. Around him, adults decided what his future should look like. Agrippina planned, Claudius ruled, Seneca taught, court officials observed, senators calculated, praetorians waited. Nero himself was shaped like a political figure on a chessboard. He learned that words had power, that gestures carried meaning, and that people at court rarely said only what they really thought. The Roman imperial family was no place for trust. Marriages, adoptions, wills, and honorary offices could make the difference between life and death. Every step was watched. Every rise of a young prince meant the possible descent of another. Especially Britannicus, the biological son of Claudius, remained a silent threat to Nero's future. As long as Britannicus lived, Nero's position was not entirely secure. Even though Nero gained importance through adoption and public funding, the question of succession remained open enough to be dangerous. There could be no uncertainty for Agrippina. Her son had to be not only a possible heir, but the most likely. It was in this atmosphere that Nero developed. He was not simply a spoiled child of luxury, but a child of political fear. He saw people rise and fall. He witnessed his mother gain power by combining patience, toughness, and strategic thinking. He learned that origin alone was not enough. You had to assert yourself, win allies, neutralize opponents, and recognize the right moment. These lessons were dangerous for a young person. Those who grew up in such a world found it difficult to develop a normal relationship with trust, love, and responsibility. The later Nero is often depicted as a symbol of madness. But the beginning of his story initially shows something else. A boy who was not supposed to become emperor as a matter of course, but was pushed closer and closer to the throne by his mother and circumstances. His life began not with absolute power, but with dependence. He was dependent on Agrippina's ambition, on Claudius' decision, on the expectations of the court, and on the consent of those groups who could carry or overthrow an emperor. This is precisely the tragedy of his early years. Nero was prepared for a role that hardly any human could fill without harm. When he finally moved close to the succession, the once endangered child had become a young man to whom Rome looked. But behind the shiny facade there were open questions. Was Nero ready to rule? Would he rule himself or remain a tool of his mother? Could a teenager who had grown up surrounded by intrigue develop confidence? And what would happen if one day this young man no longer wanted to be led, but wanted to make his own decisions? These questions lead directly to the center of his story. Because Nero was not born a monster. He was born into a world where power was stronger than morality, where family and politics were inextricably linked, and where anyone who wanted to survive had to learn to see danger behind friendly faces. Before Nero became emperor, he was one thing above all, a boy who was prepared for power by others. But no one could control what would become of him once this power was really in his hands. 2. Agrippina the Younger and the Road to Power. Agrippina the Younger was no ordinary woman of the Roman imperial family. Anyone who wants to understand her story must understand that she lived in a world in which power was exercised almost exclusively by men, but women could still exert decisive influence. They could not officially become emperors, lead legions as generals, and take over magistracies in the traditional sense. But they could create dynastic connections, arrange marriages, produce heirs, establish networks, eliminate rivals, and in the background influence the decisions that determined the fate of the empire. Agrippina mastered this art perhaps better than any other woman of her time. She was ambitious, educated, politically vigilant, and determined to a degree that intimidated even many men of the Roman elite. She was born in 15 AD as the daughter of Germanicus and the elder Agrippina. Her origins alone gave her a special status. Germanicus had been one of the most popular men of the early empire. He was considered a talented general, a beacon of hope for the dynasty, and a man who was highly regarded by the people and the soldiers. His early death in 19 AD had shaken Rome and triggered rumors of poison, intrigue, and political enmity. For Agrippina, this origin meant two things. She inherited a name that radiated glamour and legitimacy, but she also inherited the dangerousness of a family that was too close to the top. In the Roman imperial period, popularity could be life-threatening. Those who were loved too much could appear as a threat. Agrippina grew up with the awareness that she was part of an extraordinary lineage. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, the first emperor, whose name still seemed like a sacred origin of the new order. At the same time, she experienced how her family came under pressure. Her mother, the elder Agrippina, came into conflict with Emperor Tiberius and his powerful Praetorian prefect Sejan. Several of her brothers were victims of political power struggles. These experiences may have taught Agrippina early on that dissent alone does not protect. If you wanted to survive, you had to be vigilant. If you wanted to retain influence, you had to act before others acted. When her brother Caligula became emperor in 37, a new opportunity seemed to open up. Agrippina and her sisters were publicly honored. They were close to the center of power, and their dynastic value was obvious. But Caligula's rule quickly showed how uncertain such proximity could be. The emperor, who had initially raised high hopes, became increasingly unpredictable. Agrippina soon came under suspicion of having been involved in political intrigues. In 39 she was banished. For a woman from the closest imperial family, this was a deep fall. Her property was partially confiscated, her position destroyed, and her son Lucius, the future Nero, temporarily lost the protection that a powerful mother could offer him. This banishment was more than a personal humiliation for Agrippina. It was a lesson. She saw how quickly power could disappear if you didn't have enough support. She understood that she not only had to love her son, but also provide political security. In Rome, motherhood in the imperial family was never just a private role. A mother could become the architect of a dynasty. Agrippina accepted this role with all her might. Her goal was not simply her own survival, but the rise of her son. After the assassination of Caligula in 41, the situation changed again. Claudius, who had long been considered a weak, clumsy, and politically undangerous man, became emperor. Many had underestimated him, but Claudius proved to be a survivor. Under him, Agrippina was allowed to return from exile. She regained her position and slowly began to rebuild her position. She had to proceed carefully. At the court of Claudius, power had already been distributed. Claudius was married to Messalina, a woman who herself exerted great influence and whose name was later associated with scandals and intrigues. As long as Messalina lived, Agrippina could not simply rise to become the most powerful woman at court. But Agrippina waited. She knew that patience could be a political weapon. The fall of Messalina in 48 became the decisive turning point. Messalina was accused of crossing a political and personal line when she entered into a kind of marriage with Gaius Silius during the emperor's absence. It is difficult to say whether all the details of the traditional story are correct, because here, too, political reckoning, moral outrage, and later embellishment are mixed. What is certain, however, is that Messalina was eliminated and Claudius needed a new wife. This opened up an opportunity for Agrippina, which she resolutely seized. The marriage between Claudius and Agrippina in 49 was politically highly significant. Claudius was her uncle, which is why this union initially seemed legally and morally problematic. But in the imperial family, norms could be adjusted if power demanded it. For Claudius, Agrippina offered dynastic splendor. It came from the line of Augustus and Germanicus, which further legitimized his own rule. For Agrippina, marriage was the decisive step back into the center of power. A once exiled woman became the emperor's wife. But she wanted more than the rank of empress. She wanted to make her son an heir. Nero was not yet the natural successor at that time. Claudius had a biological son with Britannicus. Nevertheless, Agrippina began to shift the hierarchy. It did not rely on a single blow, but on a chain of measures that together created a new reality. First of all, Nero had to become visible. He had to appear as a member of the imperial family, as a young man with a future, dignity, and public importance. The adoption by Claudius was the most important step. When Claudius adopted Nero, he was not only given a new name, but a new political identity. He became the son of the emperor and thus suddenly stood on a level that came dangerously close to Britannicus. Agrippina understood that power in Rome lay not only in decisions, but in images, symbols, and public staging. Nero was honored, appeared in public, and was presented as a promising young prince. Particularly important was his connection with Octavia, the daughter of Claudius. This marriage bound Nero even more closely to the Claudian line. She made him not only the adopted son of the emperor, but also the son-in-law. This sent a clear signal to the public. Nero was no longer an outsider. He belonged to the center of the dynasty. At the same time, Agrippina made sure that Nero received a suitable education. Seneca was recalled from exile and made the young prince's teacher. This decision was wise. Seneca was educated, famous, and rhetorically brilliant. He was able to give Nero the appearance of philosophical education and moral formation. A future emperor should appear not only powerful, but also cultured. In addition to Seneca, Burrus, the Praetorian prefect, later played a decisive role. Here, too, Agrippina's ability to put people in positions that served her plan was demonstrated. Whoever controlled access to the young Nero controlled the future of the empire to a certain extent. Agrippina's influence grew so strongly that she almost seemed like a co-regent in public. She received extraordinary honors, her image appeared on coins, and she moved with an authority that was unusual for Roman women. This is exactly what made her admired and feared. The Roman elite accepted female influence as long as it remained hidden or moved in traditional forms. Agrippina, however, made power visible. It crossed unspoken boundaries. For many senators, this was unsettling. Not because women had no influence, but because Agrippina exercised it openly and confidently. The stronger Nero rose, the more difficult the situation became for Britannicus. Claudius' biological son remained, but his political future was increasingly darkened. He was younger, less present, and apparently less integrated into the power structures. Agrippina knew that a throne would not remain stable with two heirs of equal strength. As long as Britannicus was a real alternative, Nero's future was uncertain. Therefore, Nero had to mature faster, become more visible, and gain more support. The question of succession was a silent struggle that could not appear openly as a struggle. In the background, the tension at the court grew. Claudius was not a completely will-less emperor, but he was dependent on advisors, freedmen, family connections, and courtly power groups. Agrippina moved in this network with great determination. It rewarded allies, ousted opponents, and strengthened those who supported Nero. The ancient sources often portray them as cold and unscrupulous. One must read these judgments carefully, because powerful women were often portrayed in a particularly negative way in Roman texts. But even if you subtract the exaggerations, the image of a woman who was willing to go very far remains. She knew that hesitation could be deadly. So for Nero, the path to power was in truth the path of Agrippina. She was the driving force that turned an endangered child into a future emperor. Without her marriage to Claudius, without the adoption, without the public staging, without the connection with Octavia, and without the placement of important advisors, Nero would hardly have reached the top so quickly. Agrippina built a political stage for her son, on which he only had to appear. But this was precisely where a later danger lay. Anyone who is brought to power by such a strong mother is initially in her shadow. Nero owed everything to Agrippina, but it was precisely this guilt that could become a burden. Because Agrippina didn't just want to see a son on the throne. She wanted to retain influence. She had risked too much, planned too much, and achieved too much to return to a quiet mother role after Nero's rise. For them, Nero's empire was also their own work. But an emperor, even a young emperor, could not tolerate in the long run to appear only as a tool of another person. Thus, even before Nero's accession to the throne, the conflict arose that was later to destroy his relationship with Agrippina. The mother had led the son to power, but at the same time she had tied him to a dependency from which he wanted to free himself at some point. Thus, at the beginning of Nero's story, Agrippina stands like a mighty figure of ambition, courage, prudence, and danger. She had been a victim of political violence and became a master of political harshness herself. She knew banishment, loss, and humiliation, and for that very reason she no longer wanted to ask for security, but to force it. Her son Nero was her greatest project, her dynastic hope, and her weapon against a world that officially excluded women from a highest power. But the closer she brought him to the throne, the closer she brought the moment when the protected son would become an emperor. And an emperor could not tolerate a second power next to him, not even his own mother. 3. The death of Claudius and Nero's rise. In 54 AD, the Roman imperial family was at a dangerous point. Outwardly, the reign of Claudius still seemed stable. The emperor had ruled for years, carried out administrative reforms, incorporated new territories into the empire, and proved to be a politically effective ruler despite all the mockery. But inside the palace, the question of succession had long since become a silent threat. Two young men stood in the shadow of the throne: Britannicus, the natural son of Claudius, and Nero, the adopted son, whom Agrippina had pushed forward with extraordinary determination. In this world, discipleship has never been just a family affair. It affected the Senate, the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's freedmen, the provinces, and ultimately the entire empire. Who would rule after Claudius decided which group won at court and which perished. Claudius himself was already an aging ruler at this time, at least by the standards of his time. He was not powerless, but his environment had a great influence on him. Since the beginning of his reign, Claudius had been heavily dependent on advisors, freedmen, and wives. This made him vulnerable to the image of an emperor who was guided by others. It is doubtful whether this picture is completely fair. Claudius was by no means just a puppet. He was able to make decisions, enforce laws, and pursue political goals. But at court, the impression arose that access to the emperor was often more important than the emperor himself. Those who controlled their proximity could prepare decisions, filter information, and eliminate opponents. Agrippina understood this mechanism better than many others. It was clear to her that time was pressing. Nero was older than Britannicus and already more strongly positioned in the public eye. He bore the name Caesar, was married to Octavia, and was recognized by adoption as the son of Claudius. But Britannicus remained a problem that did not simply disappear. He was the natural son of the emperor, and in a dynastic order this weight of blood was of enormous importance. As long as Claudius lived, his attitude could change. Perhaps one day he would prefer Britannicus more strongly again. Perhaps he would realize how far Agrippina's influence extended. Perhaps Agrippina's opponents would convince the emperor to set Nero back. For Agrippina, any delay was risky. The ancient sources report that Claudius may have begun to reconsider his decision in favor of Nero towards the end of his life. Some stories suggest that he wanted to pay more attention to Britannicus again. Whether this is actually true or was embellished later remains uncertain. But politically, the possibility alone was dangerous enough. In Rome, a successor did not only have to be legally determined. It had to be presented at the right moment before rivals could act. Power came from speed, determination, and control over the places that mattered. The palace, the Praetorian camp, and the public proclamation were more important than any theoretical succession. Then Claudius died in October of the year 54. His death was immediately accompanied by rumors. The most famous tradition is that Agrippina had him poisoned, possibly with a mushroom dish prepared by the notorious poisoner Locusta. Later authors describe this scene with dramatic relish, the unsuspecting emperor eating, the poison hidden in a delicacy, Agrippina in the background as a cold planner. But it is precisely such stories that must be viewed with caution. Roman historiography was not neutral. She loved moral drama, especially when powerful women were involved. A sudden death of an emperor almost always generated poisonous rumors. Nevertheless, the suspicion fits into the political situation. Agrippina had a clear interest in Claudius dying before Britannicus could become more dangerous. Whether she actually ordered the murder cannot be proven with absolute certainty. But contemporaries and later historians apparently considered it credible because their interest in power was so obvious. What matters is what happened after death. Agrippina acted with remarkable control. Claudius' death was not immediately openly announced. First of all, everything had to be prepared. Britannicus had to be kept away from the center of power. The Praetorians had to be won. Nero had to appear at the right moment. In this short phase between death and proclamation, it became clear that rule in Rome depended not only on the possession of a title, but on staging and access to armed power. Whoever mastered the first hours could determine the future. Nero was only 16 years old at the time. He was young, inexperienced, and still heavily dependent on the people around him. But that was exactly what could have a calming effect on many at court. A young emperor allowed himself to be influenced. Seneca and Burrus, two men who were already involved in his education and political environment, could hope to run the government. Agrippina, on the other hand, expected to retain a position through her son that no woman in Rome was officially entitled to. Parts of the Senate may also have initially seen Nero as a better option than an open crisis over the succession. Stability was invaluable in an empire. A clearly presented successor was better than a power struggle. The Praetorian Guard played a key role. Since the assassination of Caligula and the uprising of Claudius, it had finally become apparent that this elite unit was not only the emperor's protective force, but also a political power factor. Without the Praetorians, no emperor could rule safely. Nero was introduced to them, and their approval was crucial. Burrus, the Praetorian prefect, may have played a central role here. He was a man of military importance and political weight. If the Praetorians accepted Nero, the most important step would have been taken. The Senate was then able to confirm what the armed reality had already created. Nero's appearance as the new emperor was carefully prepared. He was taken to the Praetorians' camp, greeted there, and then recognized by the Senate. The course of events showed the true order of the Principate. To the outside world, the facade of Republican approval was retained. The Senate awarded honors, decided on titles, and expressed recognition. But the decision had already been made when the Guard accepted Nero and did not impose any rival power on Britannicus. Rome lived on such ambiguities. The emperor was officially not simply a king, but the first citizen, the princeps. In practice, however, his position was monarchical, based on the military, dynasty, money, and public approval. For Britannicus, this moment was a disaster. It was not immediately eliminated, but politically disempowered. Claudius' son remained in the palace, but his role had changed. The possible heir became a dangerous remnant of another future. Such figures were rarely safe in the Roman imperial family. As long as they lived, dissatisfied groups could see them as an alternative. Nero might seem young and controllable at first, but the mere existence of the Britannicus reminded everyone that there was another claim. For Agrippina and her allies, this was an unsolved problem. Nevertheless, the beginning of Nero's reign was not immediately perceived as a dark upheaval. On the contrary, many could hope that a new, better phase began with the young emperor. Claudius had been successful, but his reign had also been marked by court scandals, executions, and the influence of powerful freedmen. Nero, on the other hand, could appear as a fresh face. His youth promised renewal. His education by Seneca gave him the appearance of philosophical education. His first public words were focused on moderation, cooperation with the Senate, and good government. Seneca probably wrote important speeches for him, and these speeches were intended to inspire trust. The young emperor did not present himself as a despot, but as a ruler who wanted to respect the dignity of the Senate and avoid the mistakes of earlier times. Agrippina was visibly behind the new regime in these first days and weeks. Her power was so great that she almost appeared as a co-regent. She had made her son's ascension possible, and she didn't want to be pushed out of the center now. Coins and public honors showed their outstanding position. She received envoys, moved in the environment of political decisions, and appeared with a self-confidence that irritated many Romans. Roman society could tolerate female influence as long as it remained indirect. Agrippina, however, had elevated this influence to the rank of a public fact. This was exactly where the next tension lay. Nero was emperor, but his mother seemed like the person who had made the emperor and now watched over him. For the young Nero, this moment must have been contradictory. On the one hand, he received the highest power in the known world. It became the center of an empire that stretched from Spain to Syria, from North Africa to the Rhine. People bowed to him, senators praised him, soldiers swore by him. On the other hand, everyone knew that he had not achieved this power alone. He owed it to Agrippina, Seneca, Burrus, and a carefully constructed power architecture. His reign began not as an expression of personal strength, but as the result of other people's planning. This could be useful at first because it provided stability, but in the long run, this was bound to lead to a conflict. An emperor could not appear forever as the son of his mother. The death of Claudius was therefore more than the end of a ruler. It was the moment when several hidden tensions openly entered the future. Agrippina's ambition had triumphed, but her victory was dangerous. Nero had been given the throne, but had not yet proved that he could maintain it by his own strength. Britannicus was suppressed, but not forgotten. Seneca and Burrus were given the chance to lead a young empire, but they too had to realize that power changes a person. The Senate hoped for moderation, while the Praetorians saw their importance reaffirmed. Thus Nero's reign began with a carefully staged transition that showed order on the outside and was full of unresolved questions on the inside. Rome had a new emperor, young, educated, and apparently promising. But behind this brilliant beginning stood a dead Claudius, a suspicious change of power, an overpowering mother and a repressed brother. The rise of Nero was not a simple triumph, but a step into a web of expectations, guilt, and fear. No one could yet know whether this young man would become a good ruler. But one thing was already clear: his power was born of intrigue, dynastic calculation, and a death that was overshadowed by suspicion. 4. The first years of hope. When Nero became emperor in 54 AD, he was only 16 years old. Rome had seen many powerful men, but rarely had the fate of such a great empire been in the hands of such a young ruler. The city, the Senate, the Praetorians, and the provinces looked upon him with a mixture of expectation, uncertainty, and cautious hope. After Claudius' last years, which had been marked by court intrigues, mistrust, and the growing power of individual advisors, many longed for a new beginning. At first, Nero seemed like a figure on whom different groups could project their wishes. The senators hoped for more respect and political participation. The people hoped for generosity, games, and peace. The Praetorians expected recognition and reward. Agrippina expected influence. Seneca and Burrus hoped to form a young emperor who would remain educated, moderate, and controllable. The first years of his reign were later often described as a better, almost golden initial phase. This impression is closely related to the men who surrounded Nero at that time. Seneca, the philosopher and rhetorician, and Burrus, the experienced Praetorian prefect, together formed a counterweight to the dangerous forces of the court. Seneca gave the new rule language, moral justification, and an image of mildness. Burrus stood for military order, discipline, and the connection to the guard. A complicated power structure developed between them and Agrippina. Everyone wanted to influence Nero, but not everyone wanted the same thing. Especially in the beginning, the young emperor was less a single decisive ruler than a center around which others arranged their plans and expectations. For the Senate, Nero's government began with signs of détente. In his first speeches, the young emperor promised to respect the dignity of the Senate and not to interfere in every detail of justice. He presented himself as a ruler who wanted to avoid the mistakes of his predecessors. Especially after the memory of Caligula's arbitrariness and the dark sides of Claudian court politics, this sounded promising. Nero did not present himself as a brutal autocrat, but as a princeps, as the first citizen to respect the ancient forms of Rome. Such words were of great importance in Roman politics. Even though power had long been in the hands of the emperor, the empire continued to live from the facade of common order. The Senate did not want to be reminded that on many issues it was only confirming what had been decided in the palace. He wanted to be honored, and Nero gave him that honor at first. But words alone would not have been enough. In the first few years, measures were indeed taken to strengthen the impression of a moderate government. The administration continued to work, the provinces remained stable, and there were no major internal crises for the time being. Nero was generous to the people and tried to create a positive public image. He did not immediately appear as a tyrant, but as a young ruler who wanted to learn, please, and be recognized. This search for recognition was perhaps one of the most important characteristics of his character. Nero didn't just want to be obeyed. He wanted to be admired. In the beginning, this desire could still be channeled into forms that were politically useful: mild speeches, public generosity, careful staging, the hope of a new era. The provinces also played an important role. A Roman emperor was judged not only in Rome, but in the entire empire. In Gaul, Spain, Greece, Egypt, Syria, and on the borders in Germania, governors, cities, and legions paid attention to whether the new ruler promised stability. A young emperor could cause uncertainty, but the orderly takeover of power had initially had a calming effect. The army remained calm. The Praetorians stood behind Nero. The administration worked. For an empire of this size, Stability was already a political success. Many people in the provinces were less interested in who had what influence in the palace, as if taxes remained predictable, roads were safe, courts worked, and local elites could maintain their position. Nevertheless, the initial phase was not free of violence and dark decisions. The most important shadow fell on Britannicus, the natural son of Claudius. He had been politically ousted by Nero's seizure of power, but remained dangerous as a possible rival. Precisely because Nero was young and his rule was not yet deeply rooted, Britannicus could become the symbol of another succession for dissatisfied groups. In the year 55, Britannicus died suddenly during a meal. The ancient sources report that he was poisoned. As with many deaths in the imperial family, details remain uncertain, but politically his death was clearly useful for Nero and Agrippina's project of power. With Britannicus, the most visible alternative within the dynasty disappeared. This was an early crack for the hope of a mild rule. If you looked closely, you could see that the new beginning was also built on violence. Nero himself was still difficult to grasp at this stage. He was not a ready-made tyrant, but neither was he an innocent tool. He was a young man who had learned in a very short time that supreme power was associated with fear. People bowed down to him, but some only did so as long as he remained strong. He could be generous, but he also knew that rivals could be dangerous. His relationship to power developed in an environment in which moral principles always competed with political calculation. Seneca could preach clemency to him, but everyone in the palace knew that leniency had limits when a possible counter-emperor existed. This tension between philosophical ideal and political harshness shaped early Nero. Agrippina expected her influence to be retained. She had brought Nero to the throne and saw herself as the real architect of the new order. In the beginning, she appeared with great authority. Her position was extraordinary. She was not only the emperor's mother, but a woman whose power became publicly visible. But it was precisely this visibility that increasingly became a problem. It was difficult enough for the Senate and many men of the elite to accept the autocracy of an emperor behind republican forms. It was even harder to see a woman who openly influenced political decisions. Nero, on the other hand, had to feel that his own authority was damaged as long as everyone believed that his mother was leading the hand in the background. This is where the estrangement between mother and son slowly began. It was not yet openly deadly, but the direction was recognizable. Nero wanted to be taken seriously as emperor. Agrippina did not want to be forced out of power. Seneca and Burrus had an interest of their own in limiting Agrippina's influence, because they also wanted to lead the young ruler. This resulted in a power struggle at court, which was not initially visible in major public ruptures, but shaped the internal climate. Every audience, every personnel decision, every honor could have meaning. Who was allowed to advise Nero? Who had access to it? Who spoke first? Who was highlighted in public appearances? In a monarchy that did not want to openly call itself a monarchy, such signs were politically decisive. For the Roman population, these tensions were initially only indirect. Many saw above all the young emperor who gave games, made promises, and seemed to offer Rome a brilliant future. Nero's interest in art, music, and theater was already evident, but at the beginning it was not yet visible in the radical form that would later outrage the elite. An emperor was allowed to love art, promote poets, and show himself to be educated. It only became problematic when he himself slipped into the role of a public artist. Nero was still in a transitional phase. His inclinations were known, but they did not yet seem like a political danger. Many would even like to see them as a sign of youth and cultural refinement. The first years of hope were therefore a time of double reality. To the outside world, Rome seemed to possess a young, temperate, and well-advised emperor. The government functioned, the Senate was treated politely, the army remained loyal, the people received attention. Inside, however, there were already the seeds of later catastrophes. The death of Britannicus had shown that dynastic security could be more important than moral scruples. Agrippina's claim to power inevitably led to conflict with her son. Nero's need for admiration and self-determination grew. Seneca and Burrus could steer, but not control forever. The order was stable, but it was based on a delicate balance. This is precisely why this early phase is so important. It shows that Nero's reign must not be understood from the beginning only as a sequence of madness, fire, and murder. There was real hope, real political détente, and a time when many Romans could believe that this young emperor would rule better than some before him. But hope can be dangerous if it masks deeper tensions. Nero was praised, guided, and observed. He learned that applause could mean power. He learned that enemies could disappear. He learned that his mother was strong, but not unassailable. And perhaps he also learned that an emperor did not only have to live according to the rules of others. So the first years of his government stood between light and shadow. They were not pure deception, but neither were they a peaceful beginning without guilt. In them lay the brief moment in which Nero's rule could have taken a different path. A young emperor, supported by clever advisors, could have developed into a moderate ruler. But the same young emperor was surrounded by a culture of intrigue, by the burden of dynastic violence, and by a growing desire to free himself from all paternalism. Rome still saw above all the hopeful Nero. But behind the facade, the ruler who would later strike fear into the city, the Senate, and even his own family was already beginning to form. 5. Seneca, Burrus, and the controlled rule. When Nero took power, he was still a teenager, and that was precisely the great insecurity of his rule. A 16-year-old emperor could hold the highest title of the empire, but he could hardly rule from his own experience. Rome was not a small court, but a world empire with countless interests, with old families, ambitious senators, powerful military, rich provinces, and a capital that was at once a stage, a center of power, and a political volcano. In this situation, Nero needed guidance. The decisive question was only who would take over this leadership. His mother Agrippina wanted to guide her son because she had brought him to the throne. But two men also took center stage in the new government, Seneca and Burrus. Together, they shaped Nero's first years and created the impression of a directed, moderate, and reasonable rule. Seneca was one of the best-known intellectuals of his time. He was a philosopher, writer, orator, and politician. His lyrics were about self-control, moderation, virtue, and inner freedom. But his own life was not the easy life of a reclusive thinker. Seneca moved at the center of power. He had experienced exile, had been recalled, and now became the young emperor's teacher and advisor. This connection between philosophy and court politics was full of tension. A man who wrote about moral greatness now had to work in an environment where intrigue, ambition, and violence were commonplace. This is precisely what makes Seneca a fascinating character. He embodied not only wisdom, but also adaptability. He knew that good words alone were not enough in the palace. Those who wanted to retain influence had to make compromises. Burrus was a completely different type. He was not a philosopher, but a soldier and administrative practitioner. As Praetorian prefect, he was at the head of the guard that protected the emperor in Rome and at the same time decided on his safety. The Praetorians had long been more than bodyguards. They were a political power factor. Without their support, no emperor could sleep peacefully. Burrus therefore brought something with him that Seneca could not offer: military authority. He was able to calm the guard, ensure discipline, and ensure that the young emperor did not immediately become the plaything of armed interests. A kind of working group was formed between Seneca and Burrus. One gave the lordship language, spirit, and moral splendor. The other gave her order, security, and military support. This connection was extremely important to Nero in the beginning. He had to show the Senate that he would not rule arbitrarily. He had to show the people that he was generous and approachable. He had to show the army that its interests were not forgotten. And at the same time, he had to prevent his mother Agrippina from completely dominating him. Seneca and Burrus offered him support for this. They were able to limit Agrippina's power without having to openly oppose the emperor's mother. They were able to advise Nero and at the same time give the impression that the government was in responsible hands. Nero's first speeches clearly bore the signature of Seneca. They were cleverly formulated, dignified, and aimed at reconciliation. The young emperor promised to respect the Senate, to make just decisions and not to fall into the excesses of previous rulers. For many senators, this sounded like a longed-for return to better forms. Of course, no one was so naive as to believe that the old republic could be restored. The emperor's power remained untouched. But in Rome, forms meant a lot. An emperor who insulted the Senate humiliated the old elite. An emperor who honored him at least gave her the feeling that she was still part of the order. Seneca understood the psychological side of politics. He knew that rule does not only work through orders, but through recognition, language, and symbolic consideration. Under the influence of Seneca and Burrus, a government emerged that initially seemed surprisingly controlled. Nero had important decisions discussed, did not immediately show himself to be a cruel despot, and tried to create an image of leniency. The administration continued, the provinces were not shaken, and the capital remained quiet for the time being. That was no small success. After the suspicious death of Claudius, the ousting of Britannicus, and the conspicuous influence of Agrippina, the rule could easily have fallen into mistrust and instability. Instead, Seneca and Burrus succeeded in making the young emperor appear as a beacon of hope. They created a facade of reason that was viable for a few years. But this controlled rule had a weakness from the beginning. It was based on the fact that Nero allowed himself to be steered. As long as he was young, insecure, and in need of recognition, he could take advice. But an emperor did not remain a pupil forever. The longer Nero ruled, the stronger the desire to make his own decisions had to grow. Anyone who experienced every day that people bowed down to him, that his words had the force of law, and that his will could change lives, hardly developed lasting modesty. Seneca could talk about self-control, Burrus could urge caution, but neither could cancel the effect of absolute power. In addition, there was the conflict with Agrippina. For Seneca and Burrus, Agrippina was a problem because she represented a second source of power in the palace. She had brought Nero to the throne and wanted to keep her influence. But if the young emperor was always under the eyes of his mother, he could never be fully considered an independent ruler. For this reason, Seneca and Burrus presumably supported a cautious removal of Nero from Agrippina's direct control. This process was dangerous, because Agrippina was not a woman who could be easily displaced. She knew the farm, she knew the family history, and she knew how to make alliances. Her power was not based on an office, but on origin, experience, and the claim to be the creator of Nero's rule. For Nero, this situation could hardly have been pleasant. On one side stood his mother, who had secured the throne for him and expected gratitude for it. On the other side were his advisors, who explained to him that an emperor must appear independent. In addition, there was his own desire for freedom. He was young, rich, powerful, and increasingly unwilling to be controlled by older people. The tensions in the palace were therefore not only political, but also psychological. Nero's rule was controlled, but this control may have felt more and more like paternalism to him. Seneca's own position was also contradictory. He became rich and influential under an emperor to whom he preached moderation. His opponents could accuse him of making his philosophy sound nicer than his behavior at court. This accusation is not easy to refute. Seneca did not live like a poor sage, but as a man of great wealth. But perhaps this is precisely what shows the difficulty of his situation. He wanted to have influence on Nero, and influence demanded proximity to power. Those who withdrew completely could appear morally cleaner, but they could not prevent anything. Those who stayed had to compromise and risked becoming part of the system they wanted to tame. Burrus, in turn, was bound to the reality of violence. His power came from the guard. He could ensure stability, but he also had to know that the empire was not supported by philosophy alone. The Praetorians expected reward, respect, and clear leadership. Burrus had to prevent the guard from turning against Nero or being influenced by other forces at court. As a result, he became a silent guarantor of order. As long as Burrus lived and had influence, an important part of the imperial power remained disciplined. The controlled rule of the first years was therefore neither pure hypocrisy nor genuine freedom. It was an attempt to stabilize a young emperor through experienced men. For Rome, this was initially advantageous. The government seemed predictable, the Senate was not openly terrorized, and Nero's most dangerous personal inclinations were still curbed. But beneath the surface, time worked against Seneca and Burrus. Every success of the young emperor strengthened his self-confidence. Each public honor increased his sense of special calling. Any limitation by his advisors could at some point appear to be a humiliation. Particularly dangerous was Nero's growing need for admiration. Seneca could teach him how an emperor should speak. Burrus was able to show him how to secure power. But no one could permanently dictate to him what he should desire. Nero didn't just want to be seen as a righteous ruler. He wanted to shine. He wanted to be seen, loved, celebrated. His artistic interests, his penchant for self-expression and his sensitivity to criticism did not fit well with the sober, controlled politics of his advisors. As long as these inclinations remained private or limited, they were manageable. But if they became the center of his self-image, the conflict was bound to become inevitable. In retrospect, Seneca and Burrus seem like men trying to stem a dangerous current. For a while, they succeeded. They gave Nero's government form, language, and stability. They helped to lead the Reich through the uncertain first years. They may have prevented worse things from happening when the emperor was still young and malleable. But they could not change the fact that the power ultimately lay with Nero. An advisor can steer as long as the ruler allows it. A prefect can secure as long as the emperor needs him. A philosopher can admonish as long as his words are heard. But as soon as an emperor decides that he no longer needs teachers, advice turns into an obstacle. So Seneca and Burrus were both protection and fetter for Nero. They gave him a quiet start, but they also reminded him that others thought he was immature. They helped him to become ruler, but it was precisely in this way that he had to want to prove one day that he could rule without them. In the early years, Rome seemed to be led by a sensible hand. But this hand did not belong to Nero alone. And an emperor who had learned to love applause and hate control would eventually turn against any power that stood between him and his own will. 6. Nero versus Agrippina. The struggle for control. The conflict between Nero and Agrippina was not a sudden outburst of hatred, but a slow power struggle that was inherent in their relationship from the beginning. Agrippina had not only given birth to her son, she had created him politically. Without them, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus would probably never have become emperor. She had fought her way back to the center of power, married Claudius, achieved Nero's adoption, strengthened his public position, prepared his marriage to Octavia, and ensured that important men like Seneca and Burrus supported him. For Agrippina, Nero's reign was therefore also her own work. She hadn't planned, risked and fought for years to let herself be quietly pushed into the background after his rise. But that was exactly the problem. In the long run, an emperor could not tolerate a person next to him who gave the impression that he had created him and could also direct him. At the beginning of Nero's reign, Agrippina's power was unmistakable. She did not appear like an ordinary imperial mother, but almost like a co-regent. Her influence was publicly visible, her proximity to the emperor politically significant, her name inseparably linked to the new rule. For many Romans, this was unusual and unsettling. In the Roman world, women could certainly exert influence, especially within powerful families. They were able to arrange marriages, promote heirs, maintain networks, and prepare decisions in the background. But Agrippina went further. She didn't just want to appear hidden. She wanted to be visibly recognized. This is precisely what outraged the traditional elite. A woman who had power was one thing. A woman who showed power was another. Nero had come to the throne too young to be able to break away from her immediately. In the early months and years, he needed her dynastic authority, her experience, and the network she had built. At the same time, however, he felt that her presence diminished his own authority. Every glance at Agrippina reminded us that Nero had not become emperor by his own efforts. Every piece of advice from his mother could seem like an order. Every public gesture in which she was too prominent raised the question of who actually ruled, the young emperor or the woman who had brought him to the throne. For a ruler who sought recognition and was increasingly sensitive to restrictions, this state of affairs was bound to become unbearable. Seneca and Burrus played an important role in this conflict. Both had an interest in limiting Agrippina's influence. Not necessarily because they wanted to drive Nero into arbitrariness, but because they themselves wanted to stabilize and direct the government. Agrippina was a competing source of power for them. As long as they dominated the emperor, Seneca and Burrus found it difficult to enforce their idea of an orderly rule. They may therefore have encouraged Nero to gradually distance himself from his mother. This removal did not happen immediately through open hostility, but through small shifts. Who had access to the emperor, who was present at deliberations, who prepared decisions, who received public recognition, all this became part of a silent struggle. Agrippina noticed that the situation was changing. She was experienced enough to recognize signs of the shift in power. If Nero trusted her less, if advisors weakened her position, if decisions were prepared without her, then it was not just a family insult. It was a political danger. Agrippina knew how quickly one could be pushed from the center to the margins at court. She had experienced banishment, loss, and humiliation. She knew that power did not simply fade slowly, but often ended abruptly. Anyone who was honored today could be accused, exiled, or killed tomorrow. That's why she didn't react passively. It tried to assert its influence, and in doing so it exacerbated the conflict. A particularly dangerous point was Britannicus. Although he died in 55, his existence previously played a central role in Agrippina's threatening potential. The ancient sources report that Agrippina hinted to Nero that she could support Britannicus if Nero opposed her. Whether this account is literally true is uncertain, but it shows the political logic. Britannicus was the biological son of Claudius, and thus a possible alternative to Nero. If Agrippina actually played with this name, she touched Nero's deepest fear, that his rule could not be taken for granted. To Nero, every memory of Britannicus had to act like a knife. He knew that his legitimacy was constructed, strong enough for power, but not invulnerable. The death of Britannicus therefore removed not only a rival, but also a means of exerting pressure that Agrippina could have used against her son. After the death of Britannicus, Agrippina was weakened, but not powerless. Her name, her origin, and her role in the change of power remained significant. But Nero increasingly began to go his own way. His private life in particular became a political problem. His marriage to Octavia was dynastically important, but emotionally apparently cold. Octavia embodied the connection to Claudius' family and gave Nero additional legitimacy. But Nero was attracted to other women, first to the freed act. This relationship was more than a private affair. It showed that Nero began to put his personal desires against the expectations of the court. Agrippina rejected this union because it endangered her political plan and because she apparently fought against any person who could reduce her influence over Nero. For Nero, act may have meant a space of personal freedom. In a world where every marriage was politically calculated and every family bond meant power, a relationship with a woman outside the highest elite could seem like an outbreak. But an emperor did not have a really private life. His preferences were observed, evaluated, and politically interpreted. When Agrippina took action against Act, she did so not only out of maternal jealousy, but out of power political calculations. Those who influenced Nero's feelings could gain access to his will. At court, closeness was always power. As a result, the dispute between mother and son became increasingly personal. Nero no longer wanted to be the object of Agrippina's strategy. Agrippina did not want to accept that her son eluded her grasp. This tension contained a deep human tragedy. Agrippina had protected Nero in a dangerous world, but her protection was also control. Nero owed everything to her, but it was precisely this guilt that could create resistance in him. Gratitude is hard to bear when it becomes a chain. The more Agrippina insisted on her merits, the more Nero had to feel that he was not free until he broke her power. The public image also changed. Agrippina was gradually pushed out of the center. Their honors lost weight, their immediate proximity to the emperor was limited, and their influence on decisions decreased. Such steps were highly significant in the Roman power structure. It wasn't just about who said what, but who was seen. Power had to be visible in Rome, and the deprivation of visibility was already a political attack. When Agrippina appeared less publicly next to Nero, it was a message: the emperor is no longer under his mother's hand. But Agrippina was dangerous as long as she lived. She knew secrets. She knew the circumstances of Claudius' death, insofar as she had been involved in it or knew about it. She knew the networks through which Nero had come to power. She knew her son's weaknesses. Such a person could not simply be ignored. Over time, she became less of a mother for Nero than a threat to his rule. This is exactly where the brutality of the Roman imperial family becomes apparent. Family closeness did not protect against political logic. On the contrary, it often made conflicts even more dangerous because relatives had claims, bore names, and were able to bundle loyalties. The struggle between Nero and Agrippina was therefore also a struggle to define his rule. Was Nero the son of Agrippina, who ruled by her hand? Or was he the sole emperor whose will stood above all others? This question could not remain open permanently. Although the principate was based on advice, tradition, and consent, the focus was always on the person of the emperor. A young ruler may have been led at first, but at some point he had to show that he himself made the final decision. For Nero, this step became a liberation from his mother. For Agrippina, he was treason. In this conflict, much of Nero's later character is revealed. He was not only cruel on a whim, but acted out of a mixture of fear, insult, desire for freedom, and a sense of power. He didn't want to be controlled, but he had never learned to think of power without violence. His world had shown him that rivals are eliminated, that rumors can be deadly, and that family is not a safe place. Agrippina had not only explained this world to him, she had exemplified it to him. Now this logic turned against herself. At the same time, Agrippina's behavior shows how limited her options were. She could not become emperor herself. Her power had to work through men, through her brother, her husband, her son. Therefore, Nero's independence was not only a personal rejection for her, but a political crash. If she lost her son, she would lose the instrument by which she could act in the highest sphere of power. Their harshness was therefore also an expression of a structural powerlessness. She fought with all means because she had no official position of power open to her that corresponded to her actual abilities. At the end of this development there was no reconciliation, but an ever darker question. How far would Nero go to be free from Agrippina? And how far would Agrippina go to save her position? The conflict had long since crossed the line of a family dispute. It had become a power struggle in which mother and son could no longer trust each other. Nero saw in Agrippina the woman who had created him and therefore wanted to dominate him. Agrippina saw in Nero the son to whom she had given everything and who now directed her work against her. Thus, the emperor's mother became the most dangerous opponent in the palace. Not because she led armies or held offices, but because she combined origin, knowledge, ambition, and political experience. Nero could only feel like the sole ruler when her shadow disappeared. Agrippina could only retain her power as long as this shadow remained large enough. There was no longer a neutral space between the two. The struggle for control had begun, and it inevitably led to the question that was repeatedly asked in the Roman imperial house: who must die so that another can rule safely? 7. Murder in the imperial family. The murder in the imperial family was not an isolated event under Nero, but a development that gradually destroyed the innermost ties of the ruling house. In Rome, the emperor's family was never just family. It was a political center, a dynastic promise, and at the same time a place of constant danger. Those who were related to the emperor could enjoy protection, receive honors, and live in the greatest luxury. But this closeness made every relative a possible threat. A brother could become a rival, a wife a symbol of a different legitimacy, a mother the secret ruler, a son the hope of those who were dissatisfied with the reigning emperor. In such a system, blood was understood not only as a compound, but also as a claim. That's exactly why it could be fatal. The death of Britannicus had already shown how brutal this logic was. Britannicus was the natural son of Claudius, and thus a living reminder that Nero had not been the only conceivable successor. Although Nero had been adopted by Claudius and had successfully risen to the top through Agrippina's power politics, Britannicus remained in the palace like a shadow of another future. For dissatisfied senators, disappointed courtiers, or opponents of Agrippina, it could have become a rallying point. His death in 55, shortly before his 14th birthday, eliminated this danger. The ancient sources report poison, administered during a meal, so suddenly that those present were frightened, and at the same time so politically appropriate that hardly anyone wanted to believe in a natural death. Whether every detail of these reports is true remains uncertain. But the effect was clear: Britannicus disappeared, and with him disappeared the strongest dynastic alternative to Nero. This early death was more than a crime within the family. It was a message to all those who believed that Nero's position was still negotiable. The imperial house was not a place where rivalry was simply endured. A possible pretender to the throne could not remain neutral, even if he himself was still young and perhaps had no plans of his own. In Roman politics, it was not only what someone wanted that counted, but what others could use it for. Britannicus didn't have to actively act against Nero to be dangerous. It was enough that others could think of him as an alternative. This meant that his life was politically burdened even before he himself became an adult. But the murder of Britannicus did not solve the deeper problem. Nero was now outwardly more secure, but inwardly he remained dependent on people to whom he owed his power. Agrippina, in particular, continued to be at the center of his mistrust. She had created him, promoted him, and brought him to the throne. That is precisely why she was able to threaten him. She knew the secrets of the change of power, she knew the men who had supported Nero, and she had the rank to continue to claim influence. For Nero, this mother became less and less a protector and more the embodiment of a past from which he wanted to free himself. The conflict between Nero and Agrippina intensified over the years. At first, she was pushed back politically. Their access to the emperor was restricted, their public position weakened, and their role at court reduced. But Agrippina was not a woman who disappeared quietly. She had experienced too much, fought for too much, and risked too much. As long as she lived, she could form alliances again, influence moods, and remind Nero of his dependence. This mere possibility made them dangerous. For Nero, who increasingly wanted to make his own decisions, the existence of such a strong mother was unbearable. It was not just a human being, but a political memory, living proof that his rule had not arisen solely from his own greatness. The murder of Agrippina in 59 is one of the most notorious episodes of the Roman imperial period. The ancient authors portray it almost like a dark play, full of deception, failed plans, and cruel determination. Nero is said to have first tried to have his mother killed by a manipulated ship. The construction was to break apart at sea and cause Agrippina to die as if by accident. This portrayal seems dramatic and perhaps literarily exaggerated, but it shows the desire to make the murder appear as a misfortune. Nero apparently did not want to be openly seen as a mother-murderer. Matricide was a moral abyss even in an elite accustomed to violence. An emperor could have enemies executed, he could punish conspirators, he could eliminate rivals. But having one's own mother killed touched a boundary that did not simply excuse Roman harshness. According to tradition, the plan failed. Agrippina survived the disaster and reached the shore. At that moment, the situation became even more dangerous for Nero. A failed murder attempt could not be withdrawn. If Agrippina survived and spoke openly, Nero was politically and morally vulnerable. So the covert intrigue had to become a direct order. Men were sent to her, and Agrippina was killed. The famous scene in which she supposedly pointed to her belly and demanded that the body that had given birth to Nero should be hit may be literary, but it sums up the whole tragedy of that moment. The mother who had given birth to the emperor and led him to power died at the hands of the same emperor. After Agrippina's death, Nero had to explain the events politically. A murder in the imperial family was not only a private crime, but a public event. You had to create a narrative that protected the emperor. Agrippina was accused of plotting against Nero. Her death was portrayed as necessary self-defense. Such justifications were part of Rome's political culture. Violence had to be brought into a form that made it appear as protection of the state. But whether people believed this explanation is another question. Many will have understood that here a son had eliminated his mother because he could no longer bear her power. Even if Agrippina was dangerous, the murder remained a moral shock. This moment changed Nero. Not necessarily because he would have been innocent before, but because Agrippina's death removed a last inner barrier. Those who had their own mother killed found it difficult to return to a normal order of family or political loyalty. Something also had to change for his surroundings. Seneca and Burrus were faced with a delicate situation. They could not openly condemn Nero without endangering themselves, but they could not remain completely untouched. The question of what role they played in justifying the murder has burdened their image to this day. Seneca is said to have participated in the official presentation. If true, it shows the tragedy of a philosopher who remained in the center of power and was thus drawn deeper and deeper into the moral abysses of this rule. After the murder of Agrippina, Nero became freer, but not calmer. Freedom from control did not mean internal security. On the contrary, a ruler who breaks his shackles by force often begins to see new threats everywhere. Agrippina was dead, Britannicus was dead, but the suspicion remained. The imperial house continued to be full of symbolic figures. One of them was Octavia, Nero's wife. She was the daughter of Claudius and thus closely connected to the dynastic line that Nero had used for legitimation. At first this marriage had been useful. It had connected Nero to the house of Claudius and strengthened his position. Later, Octavia became a burden. Nero apparently did not love her, and his interest was in other women, especially Poppaea Sabina, who later gained great influence over him. Octavia was popular with the people, perhaps precisely because she appeared as a silent, suffering, and innocent empress. Their popularity made them dangerous. When Nero wanted to separate from her, it was not just a private step. It meant turning away from an important dynastic connection. The divorce, her banishment, and finally her death in 62 once again showed how personal desires and political violence intertwined. Octavia was accused of acting against Nero, but many Romans saw her as a victim rather than a conspirator. Her death shook the population. For Nero, however, she was another person who had to disappear so that his will would remain unhindered. With Britannicus, Agrippina, and Octavia, Nero's rule successively lost those people who bound him most strongly to his dynastic past. Each of these deaths had its own logic. Britannicus was the possible rival. Agrippina was the overpowering mother. Octavia was the unloved wife and the symbol of Claudian legitimacy. Together, however, they show a pattern. Nero solved political problems not through compromise, but through distance. People who disturbed his safety, his freedom, or his desires were declared dangers. And dangers were eliminated. The violence must not be explained solely by Nero's character. The Roman imperial family itself created an atmosphere in which family rivalry could become deadly. Since Augustus, the succession had never been completely cleanly arranged. Adoption, consanguinity, marriage, military support, and senatorial recognition were mixed. This repeatedly gave rise to competing claims. Every relative could be a beacon of hope or a threat. Nero was particularly cruel in the way he used this logic, but he did not invent it. It was a product of a system in which power was stronger than kinship and in which the palace functioned like a battlefield without open battle. Nevertheless, his personal responsibility remained central. Nero repeatedly opted for violence. He not only let political opponents die, but people who were closest to his life. It was precisely this that made his reputation so dark. An emperor who defeats enemies can be considered tough. An emperor who eliminates brother, mother, and wife appears as someone who sacrifices every natural bond to power. For Roman authors, this was a sign of moral decay. For later generations, it became the core of the Nero image, the ruler who did not even shy away from his own blood. At the end of this chapter, therefore, there is an emperor who was outwardly stronger than before, but inwardly more isolated. The people who reminded him of his origins were dead or eliminated. Agrippina's shadow had disappeared, but with it disappeared part of the order that Nero had initially limited. Britannicus could no longer threaten him. Octavia could no longer bind him. The family that had led him to power was broken. What remained was a ruler who increasingly believed that he was only free if no one laid claim to him anymore. But this freedom came at a high price. Each murder made Nero more independent, but also more suspicious. Each eliminated rival increased the fear of the rest. Every act of violence showed the Senate, the court, and the people that proximity to the emperor did not mean protection, but danger. The young ruler who had once awakened hope became a man whose palace was filled with memories of the dead. And in Rome they knew, if an emperor has learned to sacrifice his own family, then no one is safe anymore. 8. Rome as a stage, art, theater, and imperial self-expression. Nero didn't just want to be emperor. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be remembered not only for laws, orders, coins, and military might, but for applause, admiration, and artistic fame. It was precisely in this that he differed from many Roman rulers before him. An emperor was allowed to promote art, support poets, organize games, build theaters, and show himself to be an educated man. This was even desirable, because Roman power also lived from culture, splendor, and public staging. But Nero crossed a line that was of utmost importance to the Roman elite. He didn't just want to be the patron of art, he wanted to be an artist himself. He wanted to sing, perform, race chariots, compete with Greek competitors, and receive recognition in front of an audience. What for him was an expression of his personality seemed to many senators to be a degradation of the imperial office. To understand this conflict, one must look at the Roman idea of dignity. The ruling upper class of Rome believed that a man of rank had to control himself. He was allowed to give speeches, wage wars, administer justice, offer sacrifices, and finance public games. But professional stage appearances were considered low. Actors, singers, and dancers were popular, but not highly respected in society. They offered their bodies, their voices, and their feelings to the judgment of the audience. A senator or emperor should not ask for applause. He was to receive applause because his position raised him above the audience. Nero, however, reversed this relationship. He acted as if he needed the approval of the crowd. For many Romans, this was dangerous, because an emperor who demanded applause made his dignity dependent on the judgment of others. Nero's love of art was probably genuine. He was not just a ruler who used art as a political tool. From an early age, he had shown an inclination for music, poetry, and acting. His upbringing had familiarized him with Greek culture, and Greece in particular had a special attraction for him. There, musical competitions, theater, and public performances had a different status than in Rome. Greek education was regarded by the Romans on the one hand as noble and witty, and on the other hand as dangerously soft when it displaced Roman strictness and military self-control. Nero placed himself in this Greek tradition and apparently saw himself as a ruler who could be more than an administrator of power. He wanted to create, shape, and shine. For the people of Rome, this side of Nero could be quite appealing. The general population judged an emperor not only according to senatorial standards. For many ordinary citizens, games, spectacles, gifts, grain supply, and visible proximity were more important than the question of whether a performance corresponded to noble etiquette. Nero understood that domination was also entertainment. Rome was a city of images, sounds, and masses. Triumphal processions, gladiatorial games, chariot races, religious festivals, and public buildings created emotional bonds between ruler and people. Whoever could inspire the crowd gained a power that was not in Senate resolutions, but was politically very effective. Nero made Rome a stage on which he himself wanted to play the leading role. He staged himself as a young, art-loving, generous ruler. His performances, his games, and his proximity to musical forms were not accidental. They created a picture of an emperor who was different from the old, serious men of the Senate. He was able to present himself to the people as more lively, passionate, and approachable. At the same time, he questioned the cultural superiority of the traditional elite. If an emperor himself sang and played, then the question of who was allowed to judge dignity and decency was no longer clear. The senators might be outraged, but the crowd was able to cheer. And Nero loved this jubilation. However, this desire for admiration had a dark side. Applause is never enough when it becomes the basis of self-worth. Whoever is on stage is always exposed to the judgment of others. As emperor, Nero could force people to listen to him, but even an emperor could not completely command real applause. It was precisely for this reason that his art was politically charged. When he performed, the audience could not simply react honestly. Who would have dared to boo the emperor or leave prematurely? It is reported that people had to endure his performances even when they were exhausted. Whether each of these stories is exaggerated or not, it shows a fundamental problem. As soon as the ruler becomes an artist, the audience becomes unfree. The applause is then no longer just a judgment of art, but an expression of loyalty. Nero's relationship to the theater was therefore a mirror of his rule. He wanted to be loved, but his power made real love difficult. He wanted to be recognized as an artist, but his position forced people to be recognized. He wanted to free himself from the coldness of politics, but he carried politics into every performance. Where Nero sang, there was not only a singer on stage, but the ruler of life, offices, fortune, and career. Every listener knew that. The stage was no longer an open space, but an extension of the palace. His passion for chariot racing also shows this urge for public self-expression. Chariot races were immensely popular in Rome. The racecourse was a place of mass passion, colors, parties, and emotions. An emperor who associated himself with it could demonstrate closeness to the people. But even here there was a limit. Promoting a racing team was acceptable. To act like a charioteer himself was highly problematic for a man of imperial rank. Nero was obviously attracted by the immediate tension of the competition. He didn't just want to have victories, he wanted to experience them for himself. But the more he put himself into such roles, the more he seemed to the elite like someone who did not understand the seriousness of the imperial office. This elite did not simply see Nero's love of art as a harmless passion, but as a political symptom. For senators who derived their dignity from origin, discipline, and public restraint, Nero appeared as a ruler who reversed the order of society. An emperor should stand above actors, not compete with them. He was supposed to direct the crowd, not to solicit their applause. He should embody the state, not exhibit his own feelings. In this way, Nero's art became an attack on the values of the class whose recognition he still needed at the same time. At the same time, Nero's self-portrayal should not be understood only as personal vanity. It also had a political dimension. The early principality was characterized by a fundamental problem. The emperor was de facto monarch, but was not officially supposed to appear like a king. Augustus had solved this problem through restraint, traditional forms, and careful concealment of power. Nero took a different path. He did not hide his special position, but transformed it into a spectacle. He showed power not only through Senate sessions and military symbols, but through cultural uniqueness. He did not just want to be the first citizen, but the center of a new, brilliant world. In this respect, Nero was also a ruler of images. He understood that people are not only governed by the constitution and administration, but by ideas. An emperor had to live in the minds of the people. Coins, statues, games, poems, buildings and rumors formed his image. Nero tried to actively shape this image. He wanted to appear as a youthful ruler, as an artist emperor, as a benefactor of the people, as a man who not only ruled Rome, but dreamed anew. But the bigger the dream became, the more the distance to political reality grew. Because while Nero was looking for applause, tensions were intensifying in the background. The assassination of Agrippina, the death of Britannicus, and the growing estrangement of parts of the Senate had damaged trust. A ruler whose family was marked by violence could not simply whitewash himself through art. For some people, his passion for the stage was particularly repulsive for this very reason. While blood had been shed in the palace, the emperor sang of tragic heroes and great feelings. The boundary between art and reality became uncanny. Nero played roles, while his own life had long since become a drama. It was particularly problematic that Nero apparently had a hard time bearing criticism. An artist has to endure judgment. An emperor can punish judgment. There was a dangerous mixture in this connection. Anyone who did not admire Nero's art could quickly appear as an opponent. Anyone who laughed, remained silent, or withdrew risked becoming politically suspect. So taste became a question of power. The emperor demanded not only obedience to his orders, but admiration for his person. This is a much deeper form of domination. It wants to control not only the body, but also the consent of the soul. Despite all the criticism, Nero exerted a certain fascination on many people. He was young, unusual, wasteful, theatrical, and unpredictable. He did not fit into the old image of the sober Roman statesman. That is precisely why he was remembered. His enemies could portray him as a ridiculous singer and degenerate actor. His admirers could see in him a ruler who broke the narrowness of Roman tradition. Probably the truth lay between these images. Nero was neither just a misunderstood artist, nor just a mad performer. He was an emperor who could not separate his need for art, fame, and applause from his political power. So Rome became a stage under Nero, but this stage was dangerous. It was not only songs sung and games celebrated. It decided how power should appear. Nero placed himself at the center of this production and made his personality a political program. He did not want to be in the shadow of Augustus, Claudius, Agrippina, or the Senate. He wanted to create a role of his own, bigger, shinier, and more unique than everyone else. But the more he staged himself as an artist emperor, the more he lost the support of those who wanted to see the emperor above all as the guardian of order. At the end, this chapter shows a Nero who no longer just rules, but behaves himself. His rule becomes a play, his life a role, his people an audience, and the Senate a reluctant spectator. But an empire cannot be run like a theater in the long term. Applause can support power, but it does not replace trust. Glamour can cover up violence, but it cannot extinguish it. And an emperor who loves the stage more than the limits of his power runs the risk of at some point no longer recognizing when the play ends and the catastrophe begins. 9. The Great Fire of Rome. On the night of July 18th to 19th in the year 64 AD, a fire broke out in Rome that burned itself deeply into the memory of world history. It was not the first fire in the city, and it was not to be the last. Rome was a huge, narrow, noisy, and dangerous metropolis, built of stone, wood, clay, fabric, oil, pitch, and countless open fireplaces. In the poorer neighborhoods, apartment buildings stood close together, often poorly built, towering, and overcrowded. Merchants stored flammable goods. Workshops worked with fire. Kitchens were operated with open flames, and the narrow streets acted like canals through which wind and smoke could race. A fire in Rome was never just a misfortune. He was a constant possibility, an invisible enemy lurking in everyday life. But what happened that July night was more than an ordinary catastrophe. It became a turning point in Nero's rule. According to ancient tradition, the fire began in the area of the Circus Maximus, i.e., in an area where stalls, shops, and warehouses could easily catch fire. From there, the flames quickly spread to surrounding neighborhoods. Rome was a city full of contrasts at that time. Magnificent temples, public buildings, and aristocratic houses stood next to chaotic apartment blocks where ordinary people lived in cramped conditions. The city was not ordered according to a modern plan, but had grown over centuries, confusing, winding, and difficult to control. As the fire spread, it was precisely these characteristics that became a trap. Narrow streets prevented quick help, flammable roofs carried the flames further, and the panic of the people made any organized rescue difficult. You don't have to think of this night as one big fire, but as a living, growing chaos. People were roused from sleep, animals screamed, beams cracked, smoke took their breath away, and families tried to rescue the essentials from their homes at the last minute. Some dragged children, others carried money boxes, figures of gods, scrolls, or simple blankets. Many lost everything. In a city like Rome, a lost house meant not only the loss of property, but also the loss of social security. Those who no longer had a roof suddenly found themselves on the street, dependent on help, chance, and state supply. For the poor, the catastrophe was immediately existential. It was a shock for the rich, because even time-honored places and precious possessions were not safe. The flames raged for several days. Some reports say that the fire raged for 6 days, then subsided briefly and flared up again. Entire districts were destroyed or severely damaged. Of the 14 regions of Rome, only a few were completely spared. Temples, homes, sanctuaries, works of art and places of remembrance disappeared in smoke and embers. The loss of ancient religious and historical sites was particularly painful, because Rome was not only a residential city, but a repository of collective memory. Every temple, every sanctuary, and every old building told of the city's past. When such places burned, many Romans perceived it not only as material damage, but also as a wound to their own history. According to widespread tradition, Nero was not in Rome at the beginning of the fire, but in Antium. When he learned of the disaster, he returned to Rome. The sources report that he initiated relief measures, took in the homeless, opened public buildings and gardens, and lowered food prices to secure supplies. These measures show that Nero did not simply remain idle. He had to react as emperor, because such a catastrophe threatened not only human lives, but also the political order. A starving, homeless, and desperate population could become dangerous. Rome was a city whose mass mood no ruler could ignore. Aid was therefore humanity, duty, and political necessity at the same time. But as important as this aid was, it could not prevent rumors from spreading. Already during or shortly after the fire, the suspicion spread that Nero himself had set the fire. The idea that he sang or played to the lyre during the fire and sang about the fall of Troy became particularly famous. This image later became one of the strongest symbols of his bad reputation, the emperor as an artist who sings while his city burns. Historically, this portrayal is highly problematic. She fits too well into the hostile image of Nero as an irresponsible actor and cruel self-promoter. But precisely because it is so impressive, it has survived the centuries. She condenses all the accusations against Nero into a single scene: art instead of responsibility, vanity instead of compassion, stage instead of state. But why did some Romans believe that Nero could have caused the fire in the first place? The answer lies not so much in certain proof as in the atmosphere of his rule. Nero had already made himself suspicious through murders in the imperial family, through his self-portrayal, and through his conflict with the elite. Many believed him to be capable of almost anything morally. In addition, the fire apparently brought him advantages. After the catastrophe, Nero had large parts of the city replanned, wider streets built, building regulations improved, and above all, a huge palace project built, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. For his opponents, this seemed like a motive. Had the emperor burned Rome to make room for his own dreams? This question was politically explosive, even if it could not be proved. Rumors don't always need truth to become powerful. They just need plausibility in the eyes of the people. Nero was already an emperor whom many distrusted. His desire to redesign Rome artistically and architecturally could now be used as a suspicion against him. In a city that had just burned, Every building project of the emperor sounded like possible proof of his guilt. Even measures that were objectively sensible could be under this suspicion. Wider streets could be seen as fire protection, but also as a sign of a violent new beginning. New building regulations could appear as a reform, but also as an attempt to overwrite the traces of ancient Rome. The Domus Aurea eventually became a symbol of the accusation that Nero had used the city's plight for his own splendor. For Nero, the fire was therefore a double catastrophe. On the one hand, he had to supply and rebuild a destroyed capital. On the other hand, he had to fight against an image that could hardly be controlled. An emperor could give orders, punish people, and erect buildings, but he could not simply determine what people believed. It was precisely here that the limits of his power became apparent. The more Nero tried to present himself as a benefactor and innovator, the more his opponents wondered whether this renewal had not been his goal from the beginning. The fire turned mistrust into a political weapon. The search for culprits became almost inevitable. A disaster of this magnitude requires explanation. When people lose their homes, relatives, and securities, the answer of coincidence is rarely enough. Fire could be caused by carelessness, grow through wind, and become uncontrollable due to poor urban structure. But for those affected, this was difficult to bear. They wanted to know who was responsible. In a religious world, people also asked about divine wrath, bad omens, and moral guilt. The fire was not only understood as a physical event, but as a sign of a disturbed order. Nero's opponents were able to use the fire to morally attack his rule. The emperor, who wanted to appear as an artist, now appeared as a man who treated Rome like a stage and was perhaps even willing to burn it down in order to reshape it. Whether this accusation was fair is another question. What is certain is that it had a devastating effect. Because in politics, it is not only what has happened that counts, but also what people consider credible. If a ruler has lost so much trust that he is believed to be responsible for the burning of his own capital, then his authority is already severely damaged. At the same time, one should not overlook the fact that Nero actually took urban planning measures after the fire aimed at future safety. The new buildings were to be more orderly, roads were to be wider, houses more stable and less susceptible to fire. In a different political climate, these measures might have been appreciated as sensible reforms. But under Nero, they were overshadowed by suspicion. His government had a problem that it had helped to create. Every action was interpreted by the character of the actor. A popular emperor could have appeared as a savior after a fire. Nero appeared to many as a possible perpetrator. The Great Fire of Rome was thus not only a natural or urban catastrophe, but a dramatic break between the emperor and the public. He destroyed homes, temples, and roads, but he also destroyed trust. Before the fire, Nero was already a controversial ruler for many. After the fire, it became a projection screen for fear, anger, and suspicion. The flames exposed not only the weaknesses of the city, but also the weaknesses of his rule. Rome was structurally vulnerable, politically nervous, and morally deeply divided. At the end of this chapter, there is a picture of Nero that continues to have an effect today. Whether he caused the fire cannot be proven, and there is much to suggest that the most famous accusations were reshaped by enemies. But historically decisive is that the accusation was able to gain power in the first place. Nero had distanced himself so far from parts of Roman society that they were willing to believe that he could do the monstrosity. The fire thus became the turning point of his legend. From now on, Nero was no longer just the young emperor who had killed his mother and staged himself as an artist. He became a ruler whose name remained associated with the burning city. And in the smoking ruins of Rome, a new phase of his reign began, in which guilt, fear, and propaganda became even more dangerous than the flames themselves. 10. Persecution of Christians and the search for guilty parties. After the Great Fire of Rome, Nero was faced with a problem that was more dangerous than destroyed buildings and smoking rubble. The city could be rebuilt, roads could be rebuilt, houses could be built more sturdily, and temples could be rededicated. But people's trust was much harder to repair. Rumors circulated in the alleys of Rome, and rumors were a political force in an ancient city. Many wondered whether the fire had really been just an accident. Others interpreted it as a sign of divine wrath. Still others believed that the emperor himself had triggered the catastrophe to make room for his new building plans and his massive palace complex. For Nero, this mood was threatening. A ruler could deal with open rebellion by using soldiers. But violence alone was not a sure remedy against mistrust, whispers, and suspicion. He needed an explanation, a culprit, a group to which the fear and anger of the population could be directed. In this situation, the focus was on the Christians. At that time, the Christian community in Rome was still small, foreign, and difficult for many to understand. Christianity was not a recognized power, an ancient Roman tradition, or a religion that easily integrated into the religious life of the empire. The Romans were not opposed to foreign cults as long as they did not disturb public order and did not call into question the traditional sacrifices to the gods, the state, and the emperor. The Roman Empire was religiously diverse. Egyptian, Syrian, Greek, and other deities found their place in the capital. But Christianity had a different effect. Christians did not simply worship one other god among many others, but professed a single god and rejected certain forms of sacrificial worship. It was precisely this exclusivity that made them suspicious. For many Romans, religion was not just a private conviction, but a public part of the order. According to Roman ideas, sacrifices, festivals, and rituals kept the relationship between humans and gods in balance. If this order was disturbed, misfortune could follow. A group that stayed away from common cults therefore seemed not only strange, but potentially dangerous. Christians could appear as people who withdrew from the community, disregarded the old gods, and thus endangered the protection of Rome. After a disaster like the fire, such a suspicion could grow quickly. When the city burned, people looked not only for technical causes, but for moral guilt. Ancient sources report that Nero named the Christians as the culprits for the fire and had them cruelly punished. Tacitus in particular, who wrote decades later and did not judge Nero kindly, describes that Christians were convicted not only for arson, but also for their alleged hatred of humanity. This formulation shows how strange and hostile Christians seemed to many Romans. Their isolation, their own gatherings, their rejection of certain social and religious practices, and the misunderstandings about their rituals could easily be transformed into bogeymen. In a time without rapid clarification, without a modern public sphere, and without reliable information, rumors about minorities could have a particularly destructive effect. The pursuit after the fire was therefore more than a simple punitive action. It was a political spectacle. Nero had to show that the state acted, that guilty parties had been found, and that the violated order was restored by punishment. In Rome, public executions have always had a symbolic meaning. They were not only intended to eliminate criminals, but also to make it clear to the population that power, justice, and retribution remain effective. The punished bodies became signs. They were intended to create fear, offer satisfaction, and send the message that Rome was not helpless. Tradition describes the punishments as particularly cruel. Christians are said to have been handed over to wild animals, crucified or burned as living torches. Even if ancient authors often dramatically escalated events, the core remained shattering. People were publicly made scapegoats and punished with extreme violence. For Nero, this harshness could seem useful in the short term. It diverted attention from the rumors against him and offered the population a target for their anger. But it was precisely the cruelty of the punishments that apparently also caused unease. Tacitus suggests that some people felt pity, not necessarily because they liked Christians, but because the punishments seemed less like just retribution than like the arbitrariness of an emperor who wanted to cover up his own guilt. This reveals a deep political truth. Scapegoats can exonerate a ruler in the short term, but they can also expose his moral weakness. If a government is too quick to blame an unpopular minority after a disaster, the suspicion arises that it is not justice that is sought, but distraction. This is exactly what harmed Nero. The Christians were powerless enough to be persecuted, but it was precisely this powerlessness that made the violence against them repulsive to some observers. A strong state that cruelly punishes desperate people does not appear sovereign, but insecure. For the early Christian community, this persecution became a formative trauma. It showed that the Roman state could not only be indifferent or suspicious, but deadly. Later Christian memories associated Nero with the image of the first great persecutor. In the Christian tradition, his name became a symbol of imperial cruelty and power hostile to God. Whether the persecution was already as extensive as later ideas suggest must be judged cautiously. It was probably mainly a local persecution in Rome in connection with the fire, but its symbolic significance was enormous. Nero became an archetype of the tyrannical ruler who persecutes the innocent and thus reveals his own depravity. This episode was also significant for Rome itself. It shows how the capital of the empire dealt with fear. After the fire, the community needed an interpretation. Had the fire been a coincidence? Was it the result of poor development? Was it divine wrath? Was it a crime? Every answer had political consequences. If poor urban planning was to blame, then the administration must have failed. If the gods were angry, the religious order must have been disturbed. If Nero was responsible, the rule was morally destroyed. The most convenient solution was therefore a group that was viewed with suspicion anyway. Christians fit into this pattern because they seemed alien, had few defenders, and could easily be portrayed as enemies of the traditional order. Nero probably understood that power is not only about making decisions, but also about controlling interpretations. Who determines who is to blame determines how a society remembers a catastrophe. The fire was not intended to appear as Nero's crime, but as an act of dangerous outsiders. But this control was only partially successful. The accusation against the Christians remained, but the suspicion against Nero did not disappear. On the contrary, the persecution itself later became further evidence of his cruelty. He wanted to master the story, but in the end he was dominated by it. For the Roman elite, the persecution of Christians may have been problematic less from a religious compassion than from a political perspective. She showed how Nero dealt with crises. Instead of building trust, he resorted to fear and public violence. Instead of taking responsibility transparently, he looked for a group that could hardly defend itself. That suited a ruler whose relationship to truth was increasingly shaped by staging. Nero was artist, actor, and emperor at the same time. After the fire, should also became a stage. The condemned became part of a cruel performance that was supposed to show the people that the emperor was acting. But the stronger the spectacle was, the clearer it became how little trust still existed. The moral tension of this episode lies in the fact that Nero may not have been the arsonist, but he was still guilty. Even if he did not set Rome on fire, he used the catastrophe to persecute a vulnerable minority. Even if the rumors against him were unjust, his reaction did not make him innocent. History consists not only of the question of whether someone has committed a certain crime, but also of how they act in moments of crisis. Nero stood in front of a destroyed city and an insecure population. He could have appeared as a rebuilder, reconciler, and protector. Instead, he became a persecutor in memory. For Christians, on the other hand, suffering took on a new meaning. In a world in which public shame and cruel execution were supposed to deter people, the idea of martyrdom developed within Christian memory. The death of the persecuted was not only understood as a defeat, but as a testimony of faith. This partially reversed the logic of Roman violence. What was meant to be a humiliation could become a source of spiritual strength. The state wanted to create fear, but the memory of the victims could create community. This development was still in its infancy, but it points far beyond Nero. The conflict between Roman power and Christian identity was to have a profound impact on the centuries to come. At the end of this chapter, there is Nero as a ruler who not only wanted to rearrange stones and roads after the fire, but also guilt. The persecution of Christians shows the dark mechanics of political crises. When a society is shaken, it looks for simple answers. When a ruler is under suspicion, he looks for people on whom he can shift the suspicion. If a minority appears alien and weak, it can become a target. Nero used this mechanic, but it did not save him. The smoke over Rome cleared, but the moral smoke remained. It created the image of an emperor who was surrounded not only by fire, but also by fear, cruelty, and the desperate attempt to control his own legend. 11. The Domus Aurea and the dream of the new Rome. After the Great Fire of Rome, Nero was faced with a task that would have tested any ruler. The capital of the empire was wounded. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins. Countless people had lost their homes. Old temples and places of remembrance had been destroyed. And above all, there was the suspicion that the emperor himself had profited from the catastrophe. In such a situation, reconstruction had to be more than just repair. It was a political message. What Rome was to look like after the fire said a lot about how Nero understood his own rule. He could have presented himself as a humble restorer of the old city, as a man who respectfully renews what has been lost and restores security to the citizens. But Nero thought bigger. He didn't just want to rebuild. He wanted to shape. A new Rome was to emerge from the burned city, and he himself was to stand at the center of this new Rome. The Domus Aurea, the Golden House, became the most visible expression of this claim. It was no ordinary palace, not a mere extension of imperial living quarters, but a powerful staging of power, luxury, and artistic imagination. After the fire, Nero had land in the heart of the city that had previously been densely built. There he had a complex built, which his opponents perceived as an excessive appropriation of public space. Where people had lost their homes, an imperial dream of halls, gardens, water surfaces, works of art and precious decorations now emerged. For Nero, it was perhaps the creation of an ideal world. For many Romans, it was a sign that the emperor was turning the city's catastrophe into his personal glory. The Domus Aurea was overwhelming in its effect. You don't have to think of it as a single closed palace, but as a vast landscape of power. It combined buildings, parks, artificial lakes, colonnades, and magnificent rooms to form an imperial work of art. The Roman rule had always spoken to architecture. Temples showed piety, forums showed order, triumphal arches showed military glory, amphitheaters showed generosity towards the people. Nero, however, had a complex created that glorified not so much the community as his own person. This is precisely what made them so politically explosive. It did not seem like a gift to Rome, but like a claim to possession of Rome. The name Golden's House refers to the splendor with which this complex was associated. Ancient authors report gilded ceilings, precious stones, wall paintings, stucco work, marble linings, and technical refinements that should amaze visitors. Some rooms were designed to overwhelm the senses. It wasn't just about appearing rich. It was about creating a world in which nature, art, and imperial rule merged with each other. Nero apparently did not want to live in a mere residence, but in a stage of his own self-image. The emperor as artist, builder, and center of a new order found his architectural form in the Domus Aurea. Precisely for this reason, this palace was more than a waste. It was a statement. Nero seemed to be saying that the city should not simply return to its old state after the fire. Ancient Rome, with its narrow streets, aristocratic memorials, and republican symbolism, was intended to make way for a Rome that was more oriented towards the emperor. There was something revolutionary in this vision, but also something deeply dangerous. Rome was not an empty space that a ruler could shape at will. In the imagination of its inhabitants, the city belonged not only to the emperor, but to the gods, the families, the Senate, the people, and the memory of centuries. Whoever rebuilt Rome, therefore, always intervened in the identity of the city. Nero also had sensible measures taken after the fire. Wider roads, better building codes, and a more orderly urban structure could help prevent future fires. Houses were to be built more stable, distances between buildings could make it more difficult for fire to spread, and better planning was urgently needed for an overcrowded metropolis. Had Nero confined himself to such reforms, he might perhaps have appeared as the great innovator of Rome. But the Domus Aurea changed the perception. It outshone all practical improvements. Whatever sensible urban planning happened was burdened by the impression of imperial excess. The palace became a symbol that morally obscured the reforms. For the simple people of Rome, this contrast must have seemed particularly sharp. Many had lost relatives, lost possessions, or were in need. They needed shelter, food, and security. When they saw or heard that a gigantic imperial complex was being built in the center of the city, it could seem like mockery. Of course, Rome was used to pomp. Imperial buildings were part of political life. But the timing made everything different. Splendor after a disaster can appear as hope if it serves the community. But it can also act as a provocation if it primarily serves the ruler. The Domus Aurea stood exactly on this dangerous border and crossed it in the eyes of many. The Senate also had to view the project with unease. For the aristocratic elite, space in Rome was always also rank. Houses, temples, ancestral images, and public places were signs of political memory. When the emperor claimed huge areas, he symbolically shifted the balance of the city. The palace said, "The center belongs to me." The old elite could see in this a devaluation of their own history. Augustus had already made politics with buildings, but he had taken great care to clothe his power in traditional forms. Nero, on the other hand, showed his personal standards much more openly. His architecture seemed less like service to the state than like self-deification in luxury. Nero's dream of a new Rome was not only political, but also aesthetic. He obviously thought in images, spaces, and effects. The Domus Aurea was a work of art of power. It was not only intended to impress visitors, but to transport them to another world. Artificial landscapes, water, light, colors, and precious materials created an atmosphere in which the emperor seemed almost like a creator. This combination of art and domination fits Nero's entire self-image. He didn't just want to give orders. He wanted to stage a reality. The palace became a walk-in display of its own greatness. But this was exactly where the hubris lay. A ruler who treats the city like his stage can lose the difference between public space and personal fantasy. Nero may have seen beauty, renewal, and greatness. His opponents saw appropriation, waste, and moral decay. Both perspectives explain why the Domus Aurea remained so powerfully in the memory. It was indeed extraordinary, but it was also politically unwise. It confirmed almost everything that Nero's enemies accused him of: excess, self-love, indifference to the sufferings of others, and the desire to shape Rome in his own image. Financing such projects was another problem. A palace of this size devoured enormous means. After the fire, enormous sums had to be raised for reconstruction, supplies, and public measures anyway. If, at the same time, imperial luxury visibly grew, taxes, duties, and financial burdens had to be felt as even more oppressive. In an empire that thrived on provinces, local elites, and carefully balanced loyalties, imperial extravagance could have political consequences. Domination was expensive, but it had to appear legitimate. When subjects got the feeling that they were not paying for order and security, but for the emperor's fantasies, loyalty became fragile. The Domus Aurea therefore shows how closely aesthetics and power were connected. A building can be admired and hated. It can show technical mastery and political blindness at the same time. It can create beauty and still symbolize injustice. Nero's palace was just such a building. Perhaps it was one of the wildest architectural dreams of its time. But it was created at a moment when Nero would have needed trust, not amazement. He should have shown proximity to the city, but the palace showed distance. He should have made compassion visible, but the palace showed abundance. He should have healed Rome, but many saw this as proof that Nero drew his own glory from the wound of the city. After Nero's death, the Domus Aurea quickly became a political problem for his successors. They couldn't just go on living in his shadow. Whoever ruled after Nero had to show that he was different. For this reason, some of the rooms claimed by Nero were returned to the public or reshaped with new building projects. Particularly symbolic was the construction of the Flavian amphitheater, the Colosseum, in the area of the artificial lake of the Domus Aurea. A space of imperial self-glorification became a place of public entertainment. This transformation was a political message. What Nero had taken was returned to the people. This also shows how much the Domus Aurea was considered a symbol of false rule. For Nero himself, however, the palace was probably a highlight of his dream. He was able to see himself in it as an artist emperor, as a new creator of Rome, and as the center of a luxurious world. The Domus Aurea was his attempt to adapt reality to his inner image. But an empire is not a poem, a capital is not a stage set, and people are not extras in a ruler's dream. Reality could not be completely gilded. Beneath the surface, fear, criticism, debt, memory of the fire and anger over lost houses remained. The brighter the palace gleamed, the darker the suspicion that hung over it. Thus, the Domus Aurea became the stone turning point of Nero's reign. It showed his creative will, his artistic imagination, and his aspiration to rethink Rome. At the same time, it showed his political blindness, his excessiveness, and his inability to distinguish between personal dream and public responsibility. After the fire, Nero would have had the chance to go down in history as the savior of the city. Instead, he created a structure that many interpreted as proof of his guilt and selfishness. At the end of this chapter, there is an emperor who not only wanted to rule Rome, but to possess it. The Domus Aurea was his dream of the new Rome, but this dream belonged above all to himself. For the city, it became the nightmare of a ruler who confused beauty with greatness and greatness with boundless demand. Its golden halls reflected Nero's deepest desire, to be admired, to be unique, to transform the world into a stage for his person. But it was precisely this splendor that made it clear how far he had distanced himself from the people over whom he ruled. The Domus Aurea was golden, but its foundation lay in ashes. 12. Waste, taxes, and growing resistance. After the fire of Rome and the construction of the Domus Aurea, the perception of Nero changed permanently. What had previously appeared as youth, artistic idiosyncrasy, or courtly eccentricity was now interpreted by many as dangerous excess. Nero no longer lived like an emperor who had wealth. He increasingly looked like a ruler who saw the wealth of the empire as material for his own dreams. Games, construction projects, gifts, performances, splendor, and the costly restoration of the capital devoured enormous funds. Rome was a rich empire, but even an empire could not pay indefinitely if it was headed by an emperor who put splendor above measure and put political effect before financial reason. Roman rule was based on a delicate balance. The emperor had to be generous, because generosity was an important part of his power. The people expected grain, games, buildings, and visible care. The soldiers expected pay, bonuses, and recognition. The Praetorians in Rome knew particularly well what the price of their loyalty was. The senators and knights expected their property rights to be respected and their dignity not to be violated unnecessarily. The provinces had to pay taxes, but in return they wanted order, protection, and predictability. As long as the emperor balanced these expectations, the empire could remain stable. However, if he took too much, demanded too much, or consumed too visibly for himself, this balance began to crumble. At the beginning of his reign, Nero had benefited from the hope that he would rule more mildly and sensibly than some of his predecessors. But over time, a different impression emerged. His passion for art and self-dramatization became expensive. His public games were intended to inspire, his building projects were to overwhelm, his appearances were intended to bind the crowd to him. In addition, there was the Domus Aurea, which not only acted as a palace, but also as a symbol of imperial waste. After a catastrophe in which many people had lost everything, this luxury became particularly provocative. A ruler can show wealth if he is recognized as both protector and benefactor. But when he is suspected of using the plight of others for his own glory, splendor turns into accusation. The financial burdens became increasingly difficult to conceal. The reconstruction of Rome cost enormous sums. The supply of the population had to be secured. At the same time, Nero wanted to support his own rule with festivals, rewards, and spectacular projects. To cover these expenses, the state had to draw on revenues that came from taxes, levies, confiscations, and the resources of the provinces. This could cause unrest, especially in the provinces. Many local elites collaborated with Rome because Roman rule offered them advantages: protection, status, trade opportunities, and political recognition. But their loyalty was not boundless. If Rome demanded more and more without credibly keeping moderation, even loyal groups could keep their distance inwardly. It was particularly dangerous that Nero's financial policy affected not only ordinary taxpayers, but also wealthy circles. In Rome and the provinces, great fortunes were held by senators, knights, temples, and cities. An emperor in need of money could be tempted to access these assets, directly or indirectly. Trials for alleged misdemeanors, confiscation of property, and politically motivated charges were able to meet financial and political goals at the same time. Those who fell not only lost their lives or their position, but often also their assets. This could be useful for the imperial treasury. For the elite, it was a signal of danger. Possessions were never completely safe in the Roman Empire if the emperor became suspicious or greedy. The growing resistance to Nero, therefore, did not arise for a single reason. It was a mixture of moral outrage, political fear, financial burden, and a wounded sense of status. Many senators despised his performances as a singer and actor. Others feared his arbitrariness. Still others saw his waste as a threat to their own fortunes. Some might hate him personally because friends or relatives had fallen by his rule. In such an atmosphere, different motives combined to form a common feeling: this emperor was no longer predictable. And predictability was almost as important as military strength in such a large empire. Nero did not fully understand the mood, or did not want to understand it completely. He knew there were opponents, but he relied more and more on staging, popularity, and his ability to impress people. The people of Rome were an important stage for him. Games, gifts, and spectacles could create approval at short notice. But approval that is bought or aroused is fragile. The crowd could cheer as long as they were entertained. But hunger, housing shortages, tax pressure, and rumors could quickly change the same public space. The love of the people was not the same as lasting trust. The army also had to be considered. The legions on the borders were the backbone of the empire. They protected the Rhine, the Danube, the East, and the provinces. Soldiers were less interested in Nero's artistic ambitions than in the emperor's pay, provisions, leadership, and prestige. An emperor who sang in Rome and built huge palaces could lose dignity in the eyes of some military officers. Rome needed a ruler who was taken seriously as supreme commander. Nero did not have a great military reputation. He was no Germanicus, no Caesar, no Augustus. His power was based more on dynasty, court politics, and public staging than on military fame. As long as the army remained loyal, this was manageable. But when political discontent coincided with financial burdens and a lack of military respect, things became dangerous. The provinces became increasingly important during this time. An emperor could still be celebrated in Rome and still lose support in the provinces. There were governors with access to troops, money, and local networks. They observed closely whether the control center appeared strong or weak. If Nero appeared to be excessive, unpopular, and financially distressed, ambitious men could conclude that his rule was no longer unshakable. Resistance often does not begin with open rebellion, but with inner distance. At first, people only wonder whether another ruler would be possible. Later, they ask themselves whether it is necessary. Nero's waste also had a moral dimension. In the Roman imagination, a good ruler was not poor or modest in the modern sense. Splendor was part of the empire. But splendor had to serve the state. It had to show order, honor gods, celebrate victories, delight the people, or embody the greatness of Rome. If luxury appeared only as an expression of personal pleasure, it lost its justification. This was exactly the accusation that hit Nero. His opponents no longer saw in his additions the dignity of the empire, but the vanity of a man who placed applause, beauty, and admiration above duty. Nero was not simply a spendthrift without political flair. He knew that generosity could create power. The Roman population expected a kind of excessive care from the emperor. Bread, games, and buildings were not a minor matter, but part of the social contract between the ruler and the capital. But Nero crossed the line between political generosity and personal self-aggrandizement. He did not only give to stabilize Rome. He gave and built to exalt himself. The Domus Aurea was the clearest example, but not the only one. His entire rule developed more and more into a staging of his own ego. The resistance therefore grew in layers. First there was the whisper of the elite, who despised his performances. Then came the rumors after the fire, which damaged him morally. Then the outrage over the Domus Aurea and the burdens of reconstruction. Finally, the fear of charges, confiscations, and other arbitrariness. Every new addition, every new honor, every new humiliation of the traditional sense of class added something. The emperor did not lose his foundation in one day. It was slowly being eroded. For Seneca, who was already increasingly distancing himself from Nero, this development became particularly problematic. He had once tried to give the rule moral language and measure. But the more Nero freed himself from advice and restraint, the less Seneca fit into this system. His wealth made him vulnerable, his closeness to Nero burdened him, his philosophy stood in sharp contrast to the reality of the court. Burrus, too, as long as he lived, had fulfilled a stabilizing function. After his death, Nero lost an important connection to the disciplined power of the Praetorians. The men who had directed the young emperor disappeared or became weaker. What remained was a ruler who accepted fewer and fewer borders. However, the growing opposition was not yet unified. Not every opponent of Nero wanted the same thing. Some only wanted to limit his excesses. Others wanted to protect themselves. Some hoped for a different emperor. Some were morally outraged, others simply clever in terms of power politics. This made the situation manageable for Nero at first, because fragmented resistance is easier to control than a united movement. But as soon as a ruler alienates many groups at once, a spark can be enough to turn scattered discontent into a real threat. Nero himself did not react to mistrust with real moderation, but increasingly with harshness and self-assertion. This is typical of rulers who feel that their authority is dwindling. Instead of regaining trust, they try to stifle doubt through fear. But fear is an uncertain foundation. It forces people to remain silent, but not to loyalty. It prevents open criticism, but not secret conspiracies. The more Nero intimidated his opponents, the more he confirmed their image of him. The emperor, who wanted to be loved, created more and more fear. At the end of this chapter, there is an empire that still functions on the outside, but becomes more restless on the inside. The streets of Rome are rebuilt, the games continue, the emperor appears, the palace shines, the administration works. But beneath this surface, resistance is growing. The senators are offended and frightened. The provinces feel the weight of the demands. The army sees an emperor without military glory. The people fluctuate between fascination, dependence, and mistrust. Nero has not yet lost power, but he is beginning to damage the invisible foundations of that power. The story of waste, taxes, and growing resistance shows that an emperor is not only overthrown by open enemies. He can weaken himself by asking for too much, taking too much, and giving back too little confidence. Nero wanted to transform Rome into gold, art, and applause. But gold has to be paid for, art can hurt, and applause falls silent when people have the feeling that their ruler no longer lives for the empire, but the empire for him. It was precisely at this point that Nero's rule began to tilt dangerously. 13. Conspiracies, executions, and the fear in the palace. The longer Nero ruled, the more his court turned into a place of mistrust. What had been characterized by hope, advice, and controlled power in the first years was now increasingly dominated by fear. The old pillars of his rule had weakened or disappeared. Agrippina was dead, Britannicus was dead, Octavia was dead. Burrus, who had long acted as a disciplining influence on the Praetorian Guard, died in 62. Seneca withdrew further and further and lost his former influence. With this, those people disappeared who had slowed down Nero at the beginning, advised him or at least reminded him of the limits of political reason. What remained was an emperor who became more and more convinced of his own infallibility and at the same time feared more and more deeply that he would be betrayed by others. In an imperial palace, fear is never just a feeling. It is becoming a political force. When the ruler is afraid, he observes his surroundings more closely. When the environment is afraid of the ruler, it begins to remain silent, hypocritical, or secretly seek ways out. This creates a cycle in which every silence seems suspicious and every word becomes dangerous. Nero had already experienced that power could stand on uncertain ground. He knew that his own rule had come about through intrigue, adoption, dynastic calculation, and the support of powerful groups. Precisely for this reason, he could hardly imagine that others would not also plan, tactically, and wait. Those who come to power through intrigue often fear falling through intrigue. The palace thus became a space in which proximity to the emperor was both desired and feared. Those who came close to Nero could gain wealth, influence, and advancement. But that same closeness could be deadly. A wrong word, a misinterpreted look, a rumor, or the denunciation of a rival could be enough to destroy a person. What was particularly dangerous was that Nero's reign was increasingly shaped by personal sensitivities. Criticism of his politics was risky. Criticism of his art could be just as risky. The emperor not only wanted to be obeyed, but admired. Anyone who did not praise his performances honestly enough, who did not praise his voice, who inwardly rejected his role as artistic emperor, could quickly appear as an opponent. In this atmosphere, prosecutors, informants, and courtiers gained in importance. An autocratic system often rewards those who serve the ruler's fears. Anyone who could claim to have discovered a conspiracy made themselves useful. Anyone who blamed a rival could destroy his property, rank, or influence. This created dangerous incentives. Not every accusation had to be true to have an effect. Even the suspicion could be enough. Especially in the Roman elite, where property, honor, and descent meant so much, a political accusation was a weapon of great severity. It hit not only the accused, but often his family, friends, and clients. The most important turning point in this development was the Pisonian conspiracy in 65. It was not the first discontent against Nero, but it became the clearest sign that parts of the elite no longer wanted to endure his rule. The focus was on Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a man from a noble family, rich, respected, and apparently popular enough to appear as a possible alternative to Nero. The conspiracy united different groups: senators, knights, officers, intellectuals, and people from the court's entourage. Their motives were not completely uniform. Some hated Nero's cruelty. Others feared for their assets. Some despised his public appearances. Still others saw him as a ruler who destroyed the dignity of Rome and the old elite. What united them was the conviction that Nero was no longer acceptable. However, a conspiracy against a Roman emperor was tremendously risky. The emperor was not just a person, but the center of a power apparatus. He had access to the praetorians, to accusers, to money, to pardon and death. Whoever planned against him not only had to bring about his death, but also secure power immediately afterwards. This was precisely the difficulty. It was not enough to kill Nero. You had to win the guard, convince the Senate, reassure the people, and prevent other rivals from seizing the opportunity. Every delay, every hesitation, every leak could be fatal. And it was precisely such weaknesses that many conspiracies had in the empire. The Pisonian conspiracy was betrayed before it could be successfully implemented. As is often the case in such cases, the revelation was followed not only by an investigation, but by a wave of fear. Nero reacted harshly. Now he could see his worst fears confirmed. Not only individual opponents, but men from the highest circles had planned against him. To a suspicious ruler, this was proof that leniency was dangerous and forbearance was weakness. The repression affected numerous people. Some were executed, Others were forced to commit suicide. In Rome, forced suicide was a special form of political violence. It was able to maintain the appearance of a certain dignity to the outside world, but in reality it was a death sentence. The person concerned was allowed to carry out his end himself, but the decision had long since been made. One of the most famous victims of this phase was Seneca, the man who had once been Nero's teacher, who had shaped his early speeches and given moral splendor to the rule, was now himself drawn into the maelstrom of mistrust. Whether Seneca was actually deeply involved in the conspiracy is still not clear today. But for Nero, the suspicion or the political usefulness of his elimination was sufficient. Seneca was rich, famous, and morally significant. Its mere existence was reminiscent of the early days when Nero was still controlled. Perhaps that was also dangerous. A former teacher can become a living reproach to a ruler who can no longer bear instruction. Seneca's death was later told as a philosophical departure, calm, controlled, aware of transience. But behind this literary form, there is a bitter reality. The philosopher, who had written about virtue, serenity, and freedom of the mind, died on the orders of an emperor whom he was once supposed to educate. His career shows the whole tragedy of being close to power. Those who remain at court to exert influence can moderate and shape things for a while. But he ties his fate to a ruler whom he may no longer be able to control at some point. Seneca had tried to mold Nero. In the end, he was devoured by Nero's system. Other important men were also victims of the purges. The poet Lucan, Seneca's nephew, was also forced to commit suicide. He was not only literarily talented, but also represented an educated elite that was increasingly hostile to Nero's artistic self-portrayal. The fact that Nero himself wanted to perform as an artist made the relationship with other artists particularly difficult. He could promote admiration, he could hate rivalry. When a poet gained fame, it could seem almost personal to an artistically ambitious emperor. Politics, vanity, and art mingled dangerously in Nero's world. After the Pisonian conspiracy, the atmosphere in Rome became even more difficult. Every friendship could be suspicious, every private meeting could be interpreted politically, every memory of earlier criticism could be brought back to life. The emperor had now seen a clear enemy within, and he reacted as many uncertain rulers do. He increased the pressure. But pressure does not create real loyalty. It forces people to hide their thoughts better. The more Nero had executed, the less he knew who was really loyal to him. The fear that was supposed to protect him made him more blind at the same time. The palace itself became a place of tense roles during this time. Courtiers had to show enthusiasm, even if they were inwardly exhausted or horrified. They had to praise Nero's artistic achievements, justify his political decisions, condemn his opponents, and endure his whims. A court under a suspicious ruler is like a theater where everyone has to play, but no one knows the end of the play. Anyone who shows too little enthusiasm stands out. If you show too much enthusiasm, you can arouse envy. Anyone who remains silent looks suspicious. Those who speak may reveal too much. In such a world, normal human behavior becomes impossible. Nero himself moved further and further away from the reality that other people experienced. Surrounded by praise, fear, and staged admiration, he could hardly see what real approval was. This is one of the great dangers of absolute power. The more a ruler is feared, the more he hears only what others consider harmless. The truth does not disappear, but it no longer reaches him. Criticism becomes a whisper, mockery a secret sign, resistance a conspiracy. Nero wanted applause and received it. But precisely because this applause was forced or accompanied by fear, it had to seem more and more hollow. Maybe he felt that. Perhaps this very feeling made him even more irritable. The executions after the conspiracy were also financially and politically useful. Convicted men lost property, their families were weakened, their networks destroyed. The emperor was able to eliminate opponents and gain resources. But this short-term advantage had long-term costs. Every family that lost a loved one preserved memory and resentment. Each confiscation showed the owners that their assets were not safe. Each forced suicide increased the moral distance between Nero and the elite. An emperor can kill many opponents, but he cannot generate trust by killing. Thus, the Pisonian conspiracy became a point at which Nero's reign visibly entered a new phase. Before there had been violence, murder, and mistrust, but after 65 the fear became more systematic. The emperor no longer saw himself surrounded only by individual family or personal threats, but by an entire elite, whose loyalty he doubted. The elite, on the other hand, no longer saw him as an eccentric or cruel ruler, but as a man whose proximity was life-threatening. This mutual alienation could hardly be repaired. At the same time, the question grew in the empire as to how long such rule could continue to exist. In Rome, Nero was able to exercise power through the praetorians, through accusers, and through public staging. But the empire was bigger than the palace. In the provinces, governors and military leaders observed the development. They saw an emperor who ruled the capital with splendor and fear, but whose reputation was severely damaged by parts of the elite. An open military break was still missing, but the idea that Nero could be overthrown was no longer unthinkable after the Pisonian conspiracy. It had already been thought. At the end of this chapter, there is an emperor who had outwardly triumphed. The conspiracy had been smashed. Piso was dead. Seneca was dead. Many opponents had been eliminated. Nero could feel safer. But this victory was deceptive. For each execution made it clearer that his rule was no longer based on hope, but on fear. Every dead senator, every forced suicide, every denunciation showed how far the young emperor of the early years had moved from his beginning. The ruler whom Seneca once wanted to adorn with words of clemency had become a man whose palace was marked by silence, suspicion, and blood. The fear in the palace protected Nero for the moment. But it destroyed what an emperor needed most: the belief of the powerful that their future was tied to his future. As soon as this belief disappears, only coercion remains. And coercion only lasts as long as no one sees a better option. In the years following the Pisonian conspiracy, this very possibility began to appear on the horizon. No longer only secret men in Rome, but provinces, governors, and soldiers would soon decide whether Nero could still remain emperor. 14. The Revolt of the Provinces and Nero's Fall. Nero's rule did not first break in Rome, but on the fringes of power. This is one of the most important truths about the Roman Empire. The capital was the center of symbols, palaces, games, senators, and rumors. But the real power of the empire also lay in the provinces, in the legions, in the governors, in the tax revenues, and in the local elites who supported Rome as long as they believed that this order brought them security and advantages. An emperor could still appear in Rome, celebrate, punish, and give orders, but when the provinces began to withdraw his recognition, his power became vulnerable. Nero had long believed that he could secure his position through staging, fear, and imperial authority. But in 68 AD, it became clear that an emperor does not rule by title alone. It will prevail as long as enough people are willing to accept this title. The open rupture began in Gaul. There Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of the province of Gallia Lugdunensis, rose up against Nero. Vindex was not a random rebel and not a simple rebel. He belonged to the Roman order and was himself part of the ruling class that administered the empire in the provinces. That is precisely why his uprising was so dangerous. If a man rebels outside the system, he can be portrayed as an enemy. But when a man from within the Roman administration rejects the emperor, it shows a deeper crisis. Vindex attacked Nero not only militarily, but morally and politically. He portrayed him as an unworthy ruler, a man who had dishonored Rome, humiliated the elite, burdened the provinces, and turned the empire into a stage of personal vanity. The reasons for the uprising were not only in Gaul. Nero's rule had created mistrust throughout the empire. The financial burdens had grown, the waste of the court was notorious, the executions after the Pisonian conspiracy had shaken the elite, and the dignity of the imperial office seemed to have been damaged by Nero's public appearances. For many senators, Nero was not only cruel, but embarrassing. For many provincials, it was expensive. For some military officers, he was not a ruler who deserved soldierly respect. These different forms of discontent did not automatically combine into a common movement. But Vindex gave them a direction. He turned scattered displeasure into open resistance. Vindex himself could not simply replace Nero. He did not have sufficient dynastic legitimacy of his own and no position from which he could easily become emperor. Therefore, he turned to Servius Sulpicius Galba, the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis. Galba was old, respected, aristocratic, and had a long political career behind him. He embodied almost the opposite of Nero. Where Nero seemed young, theatrical, lavish, and artistically exaggerated, Galba appeared strict, traditional, and senatorial. For Nero's opponents, he could be seen as a man of restoration, a figure who was supposed to bring back order, discipline, and old Roman dignity. Vindex realized that a successful uprising against Nero needed an alternative. Not just rejection, but replacement. Galba's decision was of great importance. At first he hesitated, because a revolt against the emperor was a game with death. Those who failed lost not only their office, but also their lives, their possessions, and often the future of their families. But the situation of the empire had changed in such a way that even caution became dangerous. If Nero continued to rule, men like Galba could also become the target of mistrust, accusations, or financial seizures at any time. Finally, Galba opposed Nero, but not immediately as emperor, but as a representative of the Senate and the Roman people. This formulation was politically clever. It made the insurrection seem not like personal ambition, but like a salvation of order from an unworthy ruler. In Rome, Nero was slow to grasp the danger. This was not necessarily because he was stupid, but because of the structure of his farm. A ruler who is surrounded by fear and flattery rarely receives clear news. People tell him what he wants to hear, or they conceal what sounds dangerous. Over the years, Nero had created a world for himself in which his art was admired, his decisions justified, and his opponents condemned. In such an environment, reality is distorted. The uprising in Gaul was initially far away, but its significance was enormous. It wasn't just about one province. It was about whether a Roman governor could publicly declare that Nero was no longer acceptable. Militarily, the situation was initially not clear. Vindex had supporters, but not the strongest military position. The Roman legions on the Rhine played a decisive role, especially those under Lucius Virginius Rufus. These troops were experienced in combat and were closer to the Gallic crisis room. At Vesontio there was a clash, and Vindex was defeated. He took his own life after the defeat. At first glance, this could have saved Nero. The first major uprising had failed militarily, its leader dead. But in truth, the damage had already been done. Vindex had shown that resistance was possible. He had brought Galba into play. He had raised the question of whether the provinces still had to recognize Nero. A defeated uprising can be more dangerous than no insurrection at all if it shows that the emperor is vulnerable. Virginius Rufus was apparently considered a possible emperor by his soldiers after the victory, but he did not accept this role. This also shows how uncertain the situation had become. Power could suddenly be brought to men who had legions at their disposal. The empire was no longer just a matter of the Julian-Claudian dynasty, because this dynasty was almost exhausted and morally badly damaged under Nero. Now it became clearer what had always been laid down in the Principate. The emperor needed the army. When the army began to think of its own candidates, the dynastic order was broken. For Nero, the situation in Rome became more and more threatening. Galba remained an alternative despite the death of Vindex. The news of uprisings, changes of loyalty, and uncertain mood among the troops shook the court. The attitude of the Praetorian Guard was particularly decisive. Nero had once carried this guard to the throne. It was the most important armed power factor in Rome. As long as she remained faithful, Nero could hope to control the capital. But Praetorians' loyalty was never purely emotional. It depended on money, leadership, political calculation, and the assessment of who had the future. When Nero's star sank and Galba rose as a possible new ruler, the loyalty of the guard became fragile. The Praetorian prefect Nymphidius Sabinus played a central role in this. He apparently realized that Nero was politically at his wits' end and began to align the guard with Galba. The soldiers were promised large gifts of money. This once again showed the harsh reality of the empire. Big words about state, loyalty, and dignity were important, but at the decisive moment, promises to armed men could turn the tide of history. When the Praetorians dropped Nero, he lost the last instrument of power in the capital. An emperor without the guard was almost defenseless in Rome. The Senate also turned against him. This body, which had long humiliated, courted, feared, and used Nero, now saw the opportunity. The Senate declared Nero an enemy of the state. This formulation had devastating significance. It made the emperor, the highest man in the empire, a persecuted man. The man, whose name had borne laws, judgments, and honors, was suddenly legally and politically expelled. This shows how much imperial power lived on recognition. As long as the decisive groups played along, Nero was master of the world. When they turned away, there was frighteningly little left of this rule. Nero's behavior in these last days often seems desperate, theatrical, and vacillating in the sources. He is said to have thought about fleeing, about a trip to the Parthians, about an appeal to the people, perhaps even about a performance with which he wanted to move the crowd. Whether all these details are exactly correct is less important than the picture they convey. Until the end, Nero also understood his power as a staging. He may have believed that words, tears, or artistic effect could win people back. But the stage had become empty. The people could watch, but could no longer save. The Praetorians were gone. The Senate had convicted him. The provinces had found an alternative. The applause he had been seeking for so long fell silent. His fall shows the loneliness of absolute power. As long as Nero was feared, many had surrounded him. Courtiers, artists, officials, soldiers, flatterers, and supplicants crowded near him. But when his power crumbled, they disappeared. This is not a peculiarity of Nero, but a basic law of courts. Many do not serve man, but the power that he embodies. When this power dwindles, so does loyalty. Nero had to learn that admiration that arises from fear or advantage does not provide support in the crisis. The uprising of the provinces was therefore not only a military process, but a political withdrawal of reality. Gaul, Spain, the legions of the Rhine, the Praetorians, and the Senate showed one after the other that Nero was no longer the center for whom they wanted to risk their future. Vindex had made the first crack visible. Galba gave form to the resistance. The Guard decided that Nero had no future. The Senate gave official expression to the overthrow. Thus, Nero's rule collapsed not through a single act, but through a chain of loyalty losses. In the long run, this moment was of enormous importance. Nero marked the end of the Julian-Claudian dynasty, the line that had shaped the empire since Augustus. His fall opened the year of the four emperors, a phase of bloody power struggles in which Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian fought for rule. This made visible what had always lurked behind the facade of dynastic continuity. If there was no generally recognized succession, the empire could plunge into military competition. Nero had not only failed as a person. With him, the attempt to make the power of the House of Augustus appear permanently as a natural order also failed. In the end, Nero remained an emperor without an empire, an artist without an audience, a ruler without protection. His fall was a response to years of alienation. The provinces had had enough of stress and uncertainty. The elite had had enough of humiliation and fear. The Guard had had enough of an emperor whose future seemed lost. The Senate had had enough of a man who had violated his dignity. Nero had believed that Rome was his stage. But now it became clear that this stage did not belong to him alone. The sets collapsed, the actors abandoned him, and the ruler of the world became a fugitive. Thus, the uprising of the provinces leads directly to the end of its history. It was not the fire alone, not the murders alone, not the extravagance alone, and not the art alone that overthrew Nero. It was the sum of all that. An emperor can survive many mistakes as long as enough people believe that his rule is better than chaos. But in the year 68, fewer and fewer believed in it. When this conviction disappeared, there was no need for a great conqueror at the gates of Rome. It was enough for the men who had carried Nero to lower their shoulders. Power fell away from him, and with it ended an entire epoch of Roman history. 15. Death of an emperor and birth of a legend. When Nero realized in June 68 AD that his rule had finally been broken, he no longer stood as an all-powerful emperor at the center of the world, but as an abandoned man on the edge of the abyss. Only a few years earlier, he had believed that he could shape Rome according to his will. He had seen himself as an artist, builder, benefactor, and center of a new imperial world. He had palaces built, held festivals, eliminated opponents, and indulged in applause, as if admiration could replace political reality. But now everything was different. The provinces had risen, Galba had become the alternative, the Praetorians had renounced their allegiance, and the Senate declared Nero an enemy of the state. The man who had once decided on the life and death of others now had to fear for his own life. In these last hours, the whole fragility of imperial power was revealed. Nero had worn titles, minted coins, made speeches, gave orders, and lived in a splendor that ordinary people could hardly comprehend. But his rule was not based on stone, gold, or divine sanctity. It was based on recognition. As long as the Senate, guard, army, administration, and people treated him as emperor, he was emperor. When this recognition disintegrated, power dissolved surprisingly quickly. The palaces remained, the statues remained, the memories remained, but the living protection disappeared. Nero had to experience that many people had followed him not as a person, but with the power he embodied. As that power faded, most of the faces around him disappeared. Tradition depicts Nero's last hours with a mixture of tragedy, mockery, and moral reckoning. He is said to have hesitated, sued, and considered various ways to escape. Perhaps he thought of escaping to the Parthians. Perhaps he hoped for help in Egypt. Perhaps he still believed that the people could be moved by a last speech. These ideas fit a man who had overestimated the power of staging all his life. Nero had become accustomed to words, gestures, and appearances having an effect. But now the stage was empty. No one wanted to take the risk of saving him anymore. No great popular uprising rose in his favor. No Praetorian cohort stood resolutely before him. No Senate sought reconciliation. The world that had carried him turned away. Eventually, Nero found refuge in the villa of a freedman outside Rome. The place was modest compared to his previous life. It is precisely this contrast that makes his fall so impressive. The builder of the Domus Aurea, the ruler of the Golden Halls, the man who had seen Rome as the stage of his greatness, ended not in triumph, but in hiding place. There he received news that left no doubt. The Senate had convicted him. He was threatened with a humiliating execution according to old custom. For a Roman aristocrat, and even more so for an emperor, public shame was often worse than death. Nero was faced with the choice of allowing himself to be captured and paraded or taking his own life. But even at that moment, Nero didn't look like a determined hero. The sources show him as wavering, fearful, and theatrical. He is said to have feared death and at the same time lamented his own importance. The saying that an artist would perish with him became famous. It is not possible to know for sure whether these words were really uttered in exactly the same way. But they fit so much with the image that posterity preserved of Nero that they became a core of his legend. In this sentence, his self-perception is condensed. Nero saw himself not only as a ruler, but as an artist. Even at the moment of death, at least according to the memory of his enemies, he thought of the greatness of his talent. This seems vain, but also tragic, because perhaps this was the only part of his identity that he clung to until the end. As the pursuers came closer, Nero finally took his own life with the help of a confidant. He died on June 9, 68 AD. With him, not only a single government ended, but the Julian-Claudian dynasty, which had shaped the Roman Empire since Augustus. This dynasty had led Rome from the Civil War era into a new order, but it had also been marked by mistrust, family tragedies, power struggles, and unclear succession. Augustus had preserved the appearance of republican order. Tiberius had become increasingly withdrawn and ruled with suspicion. Caligula was remembered as a nightmare of tyrannical arbitrariness. Claudius had administered the empire despite ridicule and court intrigues. Finally, Nero combined hope, art, murder, fire, waste, and downfall into a figure that bore all the contradictions of this early imperial period. After Nero's death, it was not immediate calm that began, but chaos. The year 69 became the year of the four emperors. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian fought for power. This made visible what Nero's fall had revealed. The empire was strong as long as the succession was recognized. But if this recognition was lacking, legions, praetorians, and provinces could stand against each other. The death of Nero tore off the mask of dynastic self-evidentness. Suddenly it was clear that it was not only blood relations or adoption that decided the rule, but also military power, money, speed, and political support. The empire survived, but it had to relearn how to legitimize an emperor. Nero himself, however, did not simply disappear from memory. On the contrary, after his death his second existence began, existence as a legend. For his enemies, he became the epitome of the bad emperor, the tyrant, the matricide, the persecutor of Christians, the arsonist, and the mad artist on the throne. This picture condensed many real crimes, but also exaggerations, rumors, and moral interpretations of later authors. Roman historiography was rarely neutral. She didn't just write down what had happened, she wanted to judge characters. Nero became a figure who could be used to show what happens when power exists without self-control, art without moderation, and domination without responsibility. But there were other memories as well. Parts of the people had apparently not only hated Nero. Some remembered games, gifts, and his proximity to public entertainment. In the eastern provinces, and especially in the Greek world, his love of art could be assessed differently than in Rome. There, his enthusiasm for musical competitions was less naturally shameful. After his death, rumors even arose that Nero was not really dead or would return. Several false Neros later appeared and found followers. This shows how deeply his name was anchored in people's consciousness. A completely despised ruler would hardly have given rise to such hopes. Nero was not only a monster in memory, but also a projection surface for longing, restlessness, and political expectations. It is precisely this contradiction that makes Nero fascinating to this day. He was not a simple madman who can be detached from history. He was a product of his family, his time, his upbringing, and a political system that placed tremendous power in the hands of individuals without creating clear rules for control and succession. That does not excuse his actions. Britannicus, Agrippina, Octavia, the victims of persecution, the executed senators, and the many nameless people who suffered under his rule must not disappear behind psychological explanations. But history becomes deeper when it not only condemns, but also asks how a person could become this way and why an entire system made such developments possible. Nero's life shows how dangerous it is when a ruler confuses admiration with trust. Applause can be forced, but it does not replace loyalty. Splendor can impress, but it does not conceal guilt. Violence can eliminate opponents, but it always creates new fear. Nero wanted to be free from his mother, free from his advisors, free from the senatorial elite, free from the expectations of traditional dignity. But in the end, this freedom did not lead him to greatness, but to loneliness. He removed all those who could limit him, and finally found himself without those ties that could have held him. So the story of Nero ends not only with the death of an emperor, but with a warning. Power without measure destroys first the trust of others, and then the ruler himself. A state cannot serve as a stage of personal longing in the long term. A people cannot be endlessly pacified by spectacle. An elite cannot be permanently shackled by fear. And a family that is seen only as a tool of power eventually becomes a battlefield itself. Nero died young, but his name survived for thousands of years. It became a cipher for cruelty, decadence, and artistic self-obsession. It was condemned, embellished, used and told again and again. Perhaps this is precisely where his real historical power lies. He failed as a ruler. As a legend, however, he became immortal. His story persisted because it posed a question that reached far beyond Rome. What happens when a person who wants to be loved is given absolute power and in the end only generates fear?